The whistle came first, shrill through the fog. Then the running, boots on wet stone, doors flung wide, voices climbing into the dark. A woman had been found in the yard off Bucks Row, and all of Whitechapel woke at once. Lanterns swung between the tenements. Constables called out names that no one answered. Somewhere a child began to cry and would not stop. Then the crowd thinned and the street went quiet again. Rain settled the dust. The gas lamps hissed low above the courts and alleys, and the shadows leaned in as if to listen. And in that hush the whispering began, the first of 1,000 whispers that would outlast everyone who heard them. Who was he? Where had he gone? And whose name would the city choose to blame? Chapter 1. The city beneath the fog, before that first whistle ever tore the fog, and before that first name was ever spoken above a body in a yard. There was only the city itself. The rain fell on it the way rain falls on any old place, without thought or warning. The gas lamps burned as they had burned every night for as long as anyone could remember, and the smoke of 10,000 chimneys drifted up into a sky that had not been fully clear for 100 years. This was London, and though its darkest hour had not yet arrived, the streets were already made ready to hold the story that was coming. Good evening, and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian, where the darkest corners of the past are told softly long after the rest of the world has gone to sleep. Wherever you happen to be tonight, let your shoulders fall, pull the blanket a little higher, and set aside whatever the day has asked of you. If you would, leave a small comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what the hour is on your side of the night. I love reading them in the quiet hours. If these stories keep you company, take a moment to subscribe and leave a gentle like on the video, for each small touch helps another sleepless soul find us here in the dark. Tonight we travel to the East End of London, in the years before the fog first learned to carry a killer's name. To understand how a whisper can spread through a city, you must first see the city as it was. In the 1880s, London was the largest place in the world, home to nearly 4 million souls, and it swelled outward every year as new trains carried in new families from the country and from the sea. The great river ran through it, dark and heavy with the traffic of the whole empire, and along its banks the docks worked day and night to move sugar and tea and coal and grain. To the west there were wide streets and painted houses, and gardens hidden behind iron gates, and shops where a single hat could cost more than a workman earned in a month. But to the east, where our story lives, the city took a different shape entirely, and it was there that the fog seemed always to settle first. The East End was not one place but many, and each corner of it had a name that the poor spoke with a certain weariness. There was Bethnal Green, and Stepney, and Poplar, and Bow, and Shoreditch, and above all there was Whitechapel, which sat just beyond the old wall of the city, and had always been the doorway through which the poorest arrivals came. It was called Whitechapel for the little chalk church that had stood there long ago, though by the 1880s nothing about the parish felt white or clean. The streets were narrow, and the houses leaned toward each other above them, and the courts hidden behind those streets were narrower still. A stranger walking east from the Bank of England could feel the change begin within a mile, as the paving grew rougher and the smells grew heavier and the light between the buildings grew thin. We must, for a moment, walk with the crowd as it moved through those streets, so that you can hear how the place sounded before any of its later fears began. Costermongers pushed their wooden barrows along Commercial Street and called out the price of oranges and herring and fried fish, and the shouts of one seller answered the shouts of the next, until the whole road hummed like a low bell. Hansom cabs clattered by, their horses' hooves striking sparks on the stone, and the drivers cursed and cracked their whips above the heads of children who darted between the wheels. Church bells rang from Christ Church Spitalfields, tall and pale above the roofs, and from St. Mary Matfelon further down the road, and their sound carried far in the evening air. In the pubs, and there were pubs on every corner, the piano thumped, and the songs rolled out into the pavement in warm gusts of gin and smoke. And beneath all of it, running like a second and quieter tide, there was the whispering, of women at the doorways, of men bent over their pipes, of children traded from lap to lap, the whispering of a place where news moved faster than any newspaper could carry it. To be poor in Whitechapel in the 1880s was not to live in one house but to move between many. A room in a private lodging cost between 2 shillings and 4 shillings a week, and even the most careful workman could rarely keep one for long. Most people stayed instead in the common lodging houses, which the poor called doss houses, and there were more than 200 of them in the parish alone. In a doss house a bed cost 4 pence a night, and if a person had only 2 pence there was still a place. The 2-penny rope, where a length of coarse cord was stretched between two walls, and the sleepers sat on a bench and leaned forward against it with their arms folded, and slept as best they could until the man of the house cut the rope in the morning, and let them fall. For a single penny, if it was a bad night and even the rope was full, one might sit up in the kitchen by the coke fire with a mug of hot water and a stub of bread. These were the terms on which thousands of souls kept themselves alive from one day to the next, and no one who had not slept on such terms could easily imagine the tiredness of a body that never truly rested. The work that paid for even those pennies was as hard as the beds were thin. Along the docks, men waited in the cold before dawn at what were called the calling-on stances, hoping a foreman would point at them and hand them a brass ticket for a shift of unloading. If chosen, a docker might earn 5 pence an hour for the roughest labour a man could do, hauling sacks of coal or bales of tea or barrels of sugar from a ship's hold until his back could no longer straighten. If not chosen, he walked home empty-handed and hungry, and the next day he came again and stood in the same cold. In the sweatshops of Brick Lane and Hanbury Street, tailors and shoemakers bent over their work by candlelight for 12 and 14 hours a day, and a good hand at trousers might make 1 and 6 in a shift, while a poor hand made less. Down at Fairfield Road in the great match factory of Bryant and May, girls of 14 and 15 dipped little sticks of pine into hot phosphorus for 4 shillings a week, and many of them lost their teeth and their jaws to the poison in the fumes, though this was still called a lucky place to work, for at least the money came regular. We should pause here, you and I, for a slow breath before we walk any further, because it matters to feel the weight of this world before the story begins to move inside it. The great mistake, when a famous crime is told, is to skip too quickly to the crime and to forget the ordinary hours that came before it, the ordinary hunger, the ordinary cold. In Whitechapel, in those years, hunger was not a rare event, but a steady companion. The workhouse of Spitalfields stood at the corner of Valence Road, and its casual ward, which the poor called the Spike, took in the destitute for a single night, in exchange for a bath, a mug of gruel, and a morning of labour, breaking stones or picking oakum. Men and women queued outside the gate at 4 in the afternoon in all weathers, and those turned away walked the streets until dawn. In every alley off Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street, women in dark shawls stood in the doorways as the evening came on, and for 4 pence, the price of a bed, precisely, they offered what little they had to sell to any man who would give it. This was called being unfortunate, and the census-takers wrote the word beside their names, and no one ever asked what other word might have served better. The buildings themselves seemed to lean into these lives. In the great rookeries of the parish, those knots of courts and passages behind the main streets, where 2 people could scarcely pass without turning sideways, the houses had been divided and divided again, until a single old townhouse of the last century held 40 or 50 tenants across its floors. Coal smoke stained every wall, a soft dark brown, and the paint of the doorways had blistered away long since, and the windows were patched with paper or with rags. From an upper floor, a family might toss the day's waste into the yard below, for there was no other place for it, and the yard was shared between 5 houses, and had a single privy for all of them. Rats moved through the walls after dark, and cats moved after the rats, and the sound of both was so common that the sleepers no longer heard it. In summer, the smell rose off the courts like a fever, and in winter the same smell froze into the stones and waited. Above all of it hung the fog. In this you must picture something quite different from the mist that rolls in off a country river. For the fog of 1880s London was not water alone, but water married to smoke. Every house burned coal, in every grate, all winter long, and the great factories along the Thames burned coal by the ton, and the trains burned coal, and the trains burned coal, and the ships burned coal, and the sky above the city was a low grey lid of soot and sulphur. When the wind fell and the damp rose, all of this settled together into what Londoners called the London particular, and what strangers called the pea-souper, a fog so thick and so yellow that a man could not see the far side of a street he was crossing, and so heavy with grime that it left a dark stain on any handkerchief pressed to the mouth. In such a fog, the gas lamps at each corner burned as small round moons, and the sound of footsteps came from every direction at once, and a person walking home could pass within an arm's length of another and never know it. The fog was not a stage effect that history added to Whitechapel afterwards. It was the plain weather of the place, and it shaped everything that could and could not be seen. Now, tell me, as you lie there in your own quiet room, does it not begin to feel a little clearer how such a place could grow a story of the kind these streets became famous for? A city of nearly 4 million souls, a parish of 200,000 poor, a night of yellow fog, a lantern that lit only 3 yards ahead, a doorway where a woman waited for a coin. Into these conditions any darkness could walk, and none would see it clearly, and afterwards no one would agree on what it had looked like. And when a darkness did walk, in the late summer of 1888, and began to leave bodies in the courts, all of these things, the fog, the crowd, the doss house, the pub, the whispering doorway, became the ground on which the story of that darkness would be told. Yet even before those first bodies, the whispering had already begun, as it always did in the East End, about smaller and older matters. There was talk on Wentworth Street about a landlord raising the rent by a penny. There was talk in Petticoat Lane about a woman who had run from her husband and taken the children with her. There was talk in the George Yard buildings about the girl who had gone out on the bank holiday and had not come home. This was the ordinary whispering of the parish, the sound it made every day of the year, and it moved through the courts like a second kind of weather. On any given evening, a servant girl in Spitalfields could learn within the hour that her neighbour had been fined at the police court, that a barge had struck the piers of London Bridge, that the Queen had appeared briefly at a review of troops, that a family of newcomers had arrived that week at the shelter on Lemon Street. The whispering carried all of these things equally, and it did not much distinguish between the true and the half-true, and the plainly imagined. It only carried. Come closer and listen to how this worked, for it is one of the small quiet keys to the whole story that is coming. In a place where most of the poor could not read, and where the halfpenny papers arrived late and mangled in the hand, news was chiefly a thing that passed from mouth to mouth over the doorstep, and the pump and the kitchen table. A rumour that began in Dorset Street at dusk might reach Cable Street by 10, and Bethnal Green by midnight, and by the time it returned to Dorset Street the following evening, it would have grown a new limb, a name added, a detail sharpened, a colour changed. No one meant to lie. The whispering simply lived, and grew, and forgot where it had begun. And in a parish where the police were mistrusted and the church was distant and the landlords were disliked, the whispering was often the only version of events that the people believed. It was, in its own way, the true newspaper of the East End. So the fog closed the streets, and the doss houses filled and emptied, and the pubs went bright and dim in their turn. And along Commercial Street, the last of the coster carts wheeled away for the night. In a doorway near Christ Church, a woman drew her shawl a little tighter and looked once in each direction, and then began to walk. In a room above a beer shop on Old Montague Street, a lodger blew out his candle and lay down without unlacing his boots. And in 100 smaller places, in the courts and passages we cannot name because history did not bother to write them down, the whispering carried on beneath all of it, low and constant, the sound the parish made when it thought no one was listening. Chapter 2. The Autumn of Terror. We come now to the season the parish would never quite lay down again, though we come to it gently, the way you might step into a cold room at the end of a long day without hurry and without alarm. If you like, let your eyes rest closed for a moment, and let the last small worries of your own day drift out of your shoulders into the pillow. For we are turning together into the late summer of 1880, when the whispering that had always run through Whitechapel began at last to carry a different kind of weight, and to press against the doors it had only slipped beneath before. The August of that year was a warm one, though warmth in the East End was a mixed blessing at the best of times, because the courts held the heat between their walls like a closed hand, and the smell of the yards climbed sharp and heavy above the paving stones. In the doss houses along Flower and Dean Street and Thrall Street, the beds were full on most nights, and men and women who had not managed to earn their 4 pence sat up in the kitchens with the coke stoves burning low, or walked the streets in slow small circles until the daylight came back. The queues outside the workhouse gate on Valence Road grew a little longer through the second week of the month, as they always did in a hot summer when the docks were slow, and the great bell of Christ Church Spitalfields rang out each hour above the crowded roofs, marking the calm turn of an ordinary August into the last ordinary August the parish would know for many years. On the final night of that month, a Friday, the streets of Whitechapel were quieter than usual, for a fire had broken out earlier at the London docks, along the Shadwell Basin, and much of the parish had gone down toward the river to watch it burn. The flames stood tall enough to be seen from Commercial Road, and the sky above the docks had held a low, uneasy red for hours, and the pubs along the way had done a lively trade in the warm dark. By the time the last of the watchers turned back for home, well after midnight, the fire had begun to fade, and the roads through Whitechapel had thinned to the usual small traffic of the small hours. The lodging-house watchmen, the constables walking their beats, a coster with a barrow of unsold vegetables headed back to Bethnal Green, and here and there a woman still walking, still hoping to find the fourpence that would keep her out of the wet. Just before 3:40 in the morning, on a lane called Bucks Row, which ran along the back of the London Hospital and past the yard of a stable and the wall of a school for the poor, a carter named Charles Cross came upon a dark shape lying against the gate of a warehouse, and stopped and looked again, and then hurried away in search of the nearest man he could find. What Cross had seen, and what the second carter he called back with him confirmed, and what the constable arriving a few minutes later would find under the low light of the corner gas lamp, was the body of a woman who had come to be known as Mary Ann Nichols, though at that hour she still lay nameless in the road, and the parish still slept around her. The constable's whistle carried, thin and sharp, along the row of shuttered houses, and one by one the windows above the street began to open, and by 4 in the morning Bucks Row was full of lanterns and voices, and the whispering had begun again, faster and lower than it had ever moved before. Come with me, and let us step back from the row itself for a small breath, and look at what the parish did next, because it is this, the parish, and not the hand that had wounded it, that is the true weight of the story. By dawn on the 31st, the body had been carried to the mortuary of the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary, and the news had already outrun any newspaper the city could print. In the doss houses along Thrall Street, where the dead woman had spent her last hours, the other lodgers turned the story from mouth to mouth over their thin morning tea, and by mid-morning her name had been given at last, and the whole of Spitalfields knew that Polly Nichols, who had been seen the night before short of her bed money and cheerful in her second-hand bonnet, would not be coming back to it. The papers of the afternoon, rushed out with rough type and a few plain paragraphs, spread the news beyond the parish and out into the wider city, and by evening the fear had begun to walk beside the whispering, quietly at first, holding its distance from the doorways, watching. For the first days of September the parish tried to carry on as it always had, because carrying on was the only thing the poor could afford to do, and the docks and the sweatshops and the great match factory did not stop for a single death, however strange it might have been. The children still went to school at the board schools of the parish, in their thin boots and their patched pinafores, and the costers still called the price of onions along Commercial Street, and the pubs still filled and emptied in the evenings. But something had shifted in the way the streets held themselves after dark. Women who had once walked home alone from a shift at the tailor's shops in Brick Lane now walked in pairs, or with a brother or a husband sent to meet them at the corner. Landlords along Hanbury Street and Dorset Street said that the doors of the lodging-houses would be knocked earlier than they used to be, as if the tenants wanted to be indoors before the light truly went. In the pubs, the singing was thinner, and the doors closed a little sooner, and the whispering had settled into a shape it had not held before. No longer only news, but news carrying warning. On the 8th of September, a Saturday morning, in the small paved yard behind number 29 Hanbury Street, a lodger going out to the privy at first light came upon a second body, and by 6 in the morning the crowd along Hanbury Street had grown so thick that the constables could not clear the pavement, and the landlord of the house was letting neighbours through the passage for a penny each to see the yard. The dead woman was Annie Chapman, and she had been 47 years old, and she had spent the last of her small coins the night before on a mug of beer and a bed she had never reached, and the parish now knew, with a certainty that no whisper could soften, that what had happened in Bucks Row had not been a single accident of the fog. The word murder began to move through the streets not as rumour but as fact, and the small papers rushed out their special editions, and the news travelled west into the great houses of Belgravia and Mayfair, and for the first time the wider city began to look east and to ask what was happening in the courts behind Commercial Street. Let us pause, you and I, and let the pace slow a little further, because there is a temptation, when a story like this is told, to hurry from one dark morning to the next as though the days between them were empty, and they were not. In the weeks that followed the death of Annie Chapman, the fear pressed on every window of the parish, and the ordinary life of the streets bent under it in small and telling ways. The rag shop on Wentworth Street sold out of its coarse iron door bolts within a week, and the smith at the corner of Old Montague Street was heard to say that he had never done such trade in bolts and window catches in the whole of his 20 years at the anvil. The girls at the match factory walked to work together in the early mornings, 4 and 5 abreast, when they had always walked in twos before. The oil lamp seller who came round the courts once a week doubled his order from his wholesaler, for every window that could hold a lamp now held one, all night, so that no doorway near the house would sit in true darkness. The pawnbrokers along Middlesex Street said that shawls and small silver rings were being redeemed at a strange rate, as though every woman in the parish were quietly gathering to herself the few things she might need in order to run. The police, for their part, walked the streets in numbers the East End had not seen for a generation. The H Division of the Metropolitan Police, whose station stood on Leman Street, put every constable it had onto the pavements after dark, and extra men were sent in from the neighbouring divisions to walk the beats between midnight and dawn. The commissioner of the whole force, Sir Charles Warren, made his own visits to the parish through the second half of September, in his tall silk hat and his dark coat, and could be seen at the mouths of the darker courts, with a lantern raised in his hand, looking down the passages as if he might catch sight of the thing the parish now feared. Yet the constables walked in pairs of blue sarge with their lamps and their whistles, and the alleys were narrow, and the fog rolled in on cold nights, and no man on foot could hold every doorway of Whitechapel at once. And then came the last night of September, and with it an hour the parish would carry in its memory long after the fog itself had lifted from the roofs. On the evening of Saturday the 29th, the weather turned wet and cold, and by midnight a hard rain was falling across the whole of the East End, and the pubs shut their doors on customers who did not care to step out into it. It was in this weather, just after 1 in the morning on the 30th, that the pony of a market trader named Louis Diemschutz shied at something in the entry to a yard beside a workingmen's club on Berner Street, and Diemschutz, climbing down with his lantern, found a woman lying against the wall and ran into the club to raise the alarm, and it was less than an hour later, at 1:45, that a constable on his beat through Mitre Square, only a short walk to the west, and just inside the boundary of the City of London, turned his lantern into the darkest corner of the square, and found a second body against the low iron rail. The 2 women were Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Edders, and the parish, when it woke to the news, could scarcely take it in, for the killer, whoever he was, had walked between the 2 places in the space of a single hour, through streets that were being patrolled that very night and had never been seen. Let us slow again and stand a moment in the quiet after that night, because what happened next in the parish was less a crime than a great collective holding of breath. On the Sunday morning of the 30th of September, the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields were fuller than any Sunday of that year, but they were not full in the ordinary way. The people were out because they could not bear to stay in, because the walls of their small rooms had grown too close overnight, and they gathered along Commercial Street and Wentworth Street and Middlesex Street in low, moving crowds, and spoke to one another in the tone of a parish standing at a funeral. The doors of the churches stood open, and the pews of Christ Church Spitalfields filled beyond the usual Sunday count, and the priest at the altar spoke of fear and of prayer to a congregation that seemed only half to be listening. Along the courts behind the main streets, women stood in their doorways in 2s and 3s, arms free, arms folded tight across their shawls, and watched each stranger who passed with a new and steady care. Through the whole of October the fear did not lift, though the weeks came and went without another of those mornings. The gas lamps at the corners burned all night in the parish, where they had once been trimmed low after midnight to save the coal. The night patrols of the constables were doubled again, and a body of citizens formed themselves into a vigilance committee and took to walking the streets themselves in the small hours in heavy coats and boots, with whistles at their necks. The pubs closed their doors earlier, and the doss houses turned away single men whose faces were not known, and the whispering had risen now to a low constant murmur, running through every house and every court, and no one in Whitechapel could remember when they had last heard the streets truly quiet after dark. And then, on a wet Friday morning, early in November, the 9th of the month, a young man knocked at the door of a small ground-floor room off Dorset Street at the back of a narrow passage called Miller's Court, to collect the rent that was owed by the woman who lived there. The room's window had been broken some weeks before, and was patched with an old rag, and the young man, when no one answered his knocking, put his hand through the broken pane and drew the rag aside and looked in. What he saw sent him running for the landlord and then for the police, and by mid-morning the passage into Miller's Court had been closed at both ends, and a photographer had been sent for, and the constables stood along Dorset Street with their arms held out to keep the crowd back. The woman inside the room was Mary Jane Kelly, and she had been the youngest of the 5 who had come to be spoken of together. And with her, the summer of the parish closed at last. Come back with me, and let us stand a small distance away from that closed passage, because it is here that our story must lift its eyes and take in the larger shape of what the parish had lived through. Between the 31st of August and the 9th of November, in a stretch of streets no more than a mile across, 5 women had been lost. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, and the whole of Whitechapel had learned to walk with its head turned. The papers of the country had taken up the story, and the papers of the world had followed, and the East End had become, for a season, the darkest name on the map of the empire. The vigilance committees kept up their patrols through the last weeks of the year, and the constables kept up theirs, and Sir Charles Warren in his tall hat still came from time to time to stand at the corners of the courts and look down the passages, and no one still had been taken. At the doorways along Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street, in the raw evenings that followed, the women who remained drew their shawls a little tighter about their shoulders and spoke to one another in low, careful voices, and their whispering carried something new inside it now. A small, hard grain of the last few months, which the parish would not soon set down. In a room above a shop on Commercial Street, a lodger sat at his window with his lamp turned low and watched a constable pass slowly along the pavement below, the man's blue serge dark against the wet stone, his lantern swinging in his hand, his boots striking a small even rhythm along the road. The constable turned into a narrow alley, and the light of his lantern brushed the far wall for a moment, and then was gone. On Chapter 3. A name for the darkness stay with me here. In the quiet after the lantern went, because what came next in the parish was not another body, but something almost harder to bear, a long stretch of days and weeks and finally months in which the streets simply waited, and no one came, and no one was taken, and the fear that had risen with the murders had nowhere left to go. This is where the whispering began, for the first time, to grow hungry, for a fear that cannot rest on a name will begin, sooner or later, to look for one, and the parish of Whitechapel, through the last autumn of 1888, had become a parish looking for a name. 1888 had become a parish looking for a name. Let us step into the offices of the H Division on Leman Street, where the search for that name was held together by a handful of men working long past the ends of their shifts. The senior investigating officer on the ground was a stout, grey-whiskered detective inspector named Frederick Aberline, who had been chief of the local plainclothes officers for years before his promotion to Scotland Yard, and had been sent back east because he knew the courts and the pubs and the doss-houses better than any man in the force. Under him worked Detective Inspector Henry Moore and Detective Sergeant William Thick, and above him at Scotland Yard sat Sir Charles Warren as Commissioner and Sir Robert Anderson as head of the Criminal Investigation Department. And beyond them, the Home Secretary himself watched the case in a mood that grew steadily blacker as the weeks passed. In the small back rooms of Leman Street, the constables carried in their notes and their tips and their small dog-eared witness statements, and the paper piled up on the desks in unsteady towers, and the gas jets burned late into every night, while the men bent over what they had. The methods they used were the methods of the age, and they were doing their best with them. But the age had not yet learned much of what a later century would learn about the tracing of a stranger. There was no true science yet of fingerprints. That would come only in the next decade, and would arrive too late to touch this case. There was no ready means of taking a photograph inside a dim court, and no way to send an image quickly from one police station to another. The identification of a suspect rested chiefly on the memory of a witness under gaslight, which is to say on a memory formed at the worst moment of a person's life, in a fog thick enough to hide the far side of a road. The constables walked the streets, and the detectives called at the pubs and the lodging-houses, and the sketch of a face was passed from hand to hand, and none of it was enough. Come with me and let us walk out among the streets themselves in those weeks, for the parish had begun to organise itself in ways it had never tried before. On the 16th of September, in an upstairs room of a public house called the Crown, on Mile End Road, a small group of local shopkeepers and tradesmen met and formed themselves into what they called the Mile End Vigilance Committee, and they chose as their president a builder named George Lusk of Alderney Road, a stout and plain-spoken man in his 40s who had done reasonably well for himself, and who now believed the police were not enough. The committee met each night at the Crown, and its members took to walking the streets in pairs after midnight, with heavy boots and stout coats and whistles at their necks, patrolling the darker courts between the constables' beats. They offered a reward out of their own pockets for information leading to an arrest, and they wrote to the Home Office to ask for a government reward. And when that request was refused, they wrote again and again, and let it be known in the parish that they would not be quiet. Other committees followed. The St. Jude's Vigilance Committee, based near Toynbee Hall, drew its members from among the young men who worked at the settlement house there and had come east from Oxford and Cambridge to teach the poor. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, larger and rougher than the Mile End body, took its members from the small traders of Commercial Street. Between them, on any given night in October, several dozen private citizens walked the parish with their lanterns and their whistles, alongside the doubled patrols of the H Division and the plain-clothes officers dressed as costermongers or dockers, or, in one much-mocked experiment, as women. Toward the end of the month, the yard even tried the use of a pair of bloodhounds sent out for a trial run in Regent's Park, but the dogs proved unwilling to work in the open city, and the plan was quietly set aside. Let us slow for a moment, because it was during these same weeks, while the parish walked and the constables searched and the committees met at the Crown, that the whispering began at last to find its name. And the Trentice simply the Bythe, and what then the guide of the bead, Paul the Sand, then addressed and the sanctuary died, by the sign you would for the man of the fact that it entist critical work what the to you your Nina my made for the There is a small quiet fact worth carrying with you, and it is this. Many of the detectives closest to the case came in later years to believe that the Dear Boss letter and the saucy Jackie postcard had almost certainly been written by a journalist, and not by any killer at all. The neat, playful hand did not match the writing later suspected in a further and grimmer letter that came in October to George Lusk. Yet the name had been given, and once a fear has a name, it does not easily go back to being a fear without one. Whoever had first inked that signature, the parish and the papers had taken it up, and the whispering along Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street now spoke it aloud, and the darkness the parish had lived beside for a season now had a face on it, at least in words, a Jack, a Ripper, a man with a red hand and a jaunty voice. And come, walk with me a little further, because a fear that has been given a name will next begin to ask what the man behind the name looks like, and this is where the parish began to bend under a weight the constables could not lift for it. In the pubs and the doss houses for October, half a dozen theories moved from mouth to mouth in place of any single face. Some said the killer was a doctor, for who else would know the shapes of the body so surely, and this theory ran along Whitechapel Road because it made the darkness clever, and a clever darkness was somehow easier to fear than a stupid one. Some said he was a butcher or a slaughterman from the nearby markets, for the district had many and they came off shift with the marks of their trade on their aprons. Some said he was a sailor off a foreign ship at the docks, come ashore for a week and gone again, and this theory ran along Cable Street because it made the killer a stranger who could be watched for at the gangplanks. Some said he was a mad Russian or a mad Pole or a Polish Jew, and this last theory ran through the parish with a heat and a swiftness that the more careful officers would afterwards regret. For in the first week of September, before the letters and the name, the papers had already picked up a nickname of their own, Leather Apron, attached to a shadowy figure said to have bullied the women of the doss houses for months. A local reporter had written up the tale, and other papers had followed, and within days a hunt was on for any man in the parish who fitted the description of a small, dark, foreign-looking bootmaker with a leather apron. On the 10th of September, Detective Sergeant Thick arrested a Polish-Jewish bootmaker named John Pizer at his sister's house on Mulberry Street, and brought him in as the man the papers had described. Pizer, questioned closely, gave a full account of where he had been on the nights of the two murders then known, and every part of his account was checked and confirmed by witnesses, and after several days at Leman Street he was released without a charge. He appeared at the Chapman inquest to clear his name in public, and told the coroner in a plain, steady voice that he had come only to say that he was not the man. Yet the harm had already begun to run, for the name Leather Apron had done its work, and along the courts of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, the anger that had risen with the murders now turned in a direction it should never have been let turn. On the night of the 30th of September, the same night on which Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Edoise were killed, a small chalk message was found on the black brick of a doorway in Galston Street, in the eastern part of the parish, above a scrap of blood-stained apron which had been dropped there and appeared to have come from Mitre Square. The words were plain and awkward and were written in a schoolboy hand, "The Jews of the men that will not be blamed for nothing, and their meaning was and remains uncertain. What followed, however, is not uncertain at all, for Sir Charles Warren himself came to the doorway before dawn, and after a short and heated conversation with the officers of the city police, who had wished to photograph the writing before touching it, he ordered the message washed away. Warren feared, he said, that if the words were left up until the market opened and the crowd came out into the streets, a riot would sweep through the courts against the Jewish tailors and cobblers of the parish, and blood would fall in the East End that no constable could stop. Whether he was right or wrong to give that order is a question the century that followed argued at some length. What is not in doubt is that a small piece of writing that might have carried some meaning was lost, and that the whispering, denied that scrap of evidence, only turned faster. Come now, and let us stand for a moment in the mind of the parish through the middle of October, because a picture is beginning to form of what a hungry fear does to a place. The doss-houses turned away single men whose faces they did not know, and quietly refused beds to foreigners. And the boarding-house keepers along Berner Street and Fashion Street watched their newer tenants with careful and unfriendly eyes. In the pubs, a stranger who ordered in an accent could feel the room grow small around him. On Cable Street, a Jewish tailor was pelted with mud by boys who had heard something at their kitchen table. Along Commercial Road, the police were called twice in a single week to break up small crowds that had gathered around a foreign-looking man for no reason but that he had walked past them with a bag in his hand. The whispering, having found no true face to point at, was now pointing at any face that stood out, and the constables of the H Division spent as much of their nights protecting men in doorways as they did looking for the man who was not there. It was in this atmosphere that a further letter arrived, on the 16th of October, at the Alderney Road house of George Lusk. The parcel was small and had been posted the previous day, and when Lusk opened it in his front room, in the presence of his sister-in-law, he found a short note written in a rougher and less confident hand than the Dear Boss letter, and inside a small cardboard box, half of a human kidney preserved in wine spirits. The note was signed only from hell, and it mocked the police in language cruder and darker than any that had come before. Lusk had first believed the whole thing to be another cruel joke, and set the box aside on a shelf in his kitchen for 2 days before his committee persuaded him to bring it to a doctor at the London hospital, who confirmed that the organ was indeed from a human body. Whether it had come from the woman lost at Mitra Square, or from some anatomy specimen sold out of a hospital cellar, no one could say for certain, and the argument runs on to this day. But the letter and the small box entered the story with the letters that had come before, and the parish now believed the killer wrote to them. Let us slow and stand for a small breath at George Lusk's front door on Alderney Road, because through those weeks the whispering had begun to travel outward from Whitechapel in a way it had not travelled before. The papers of the country had taken up the letters and printed facsimiles of the writing, and the papers of the continent had picked up the story from them, and even the great houses of the West End were speaking of the East End at their dinner tables. In Belgravia and Mayfair, ladies with pearl combs in their hair leaned toward one another over the soup and asked in low voices what could be done, and their husbands, over cigars, offered their own theories in the same tones the doss-house lodgers used at Dorset Street. In the smoking rooms of the great clubs on Pall Mall, retired officers of the Empire proposed that a company of soldiers be sent into Whitechapel to bring the killer out. In the pulpits of the cathedrals, on the Sundays of October and November, ministers spoke of the sins of the age and of the wages of poverty and of the wrath of a divine hand that had been raised against a wicked city. And in each of these rooms, in its own accent, the whispering went on. There is one last thing to notice before we set the year down for a while, and it is this. Through all these weeks, in all these places, the darkness at the centre of the story was still nameless in any true and useful sense, for Jack the Ripper was only a signature at the end of a letter that many suspected was not from the killer at all. The parish had a name it could speak, but not a face to attach to it, and the papers had a headline they could set in tall type but no photograph to print beneath it. The whispering, hungry now, had grown so used to speaking a name without a face that it began to reach outward, past the courts of Whitechapel and past the sweatshops of Brick Lane, and to ask, in the quiet hours after the pubs had closed, whose face in the end the name might come to wear. And so the fear that had begun on Bucks Row in the last hour of August had, by the middle of November, become something different in kind. Not the fear of a killer among the poor, but the fear of a killer whose face might yet be sought, wrongly and without warning, in almost any doorway in the Empire. Along Alderney Road that evening, George Lusk drew the shutters closed against the wet dark, and set his lamp on the table, and the whispering carried on around his house without him, through the streets and the courts and the yards and the shuttered doorways, low and steady, still asking its question and still finding no answer, and still turning at every sound. Chapter 4. The grandson of the Queen, come away with me now, if you will, from the wet streets of Whitechapel, and from the shutters at George Lusk's window, and from the low steady question that still ran through the courts. Set the East End down for a while, gently, the way you would set a heavy book on the small table beside your bed, and let us walk together into a different England altogether, into rooms where the lamps were trimmed by servants and where the fires burned all night, into a world so far removed from the courts off Dorr Street that they might have belonged to two different kingdoms rather than to one. For while the parish waited for a face to be given to its darkness, another life had already been lived, quietly and largely out of view, that would one day be pressed by other hands into the shape of that face. And to understand how a false story could rise to fit a real name, you must first meet the young man behind the name as he truly was, long before the whispering ever thought to reach for him. On the 8th of January in 1864, at Frogmore House, on the great royal estate at Windsor, a small and rather thin baby boy was born nearly 2 months before he was expected, and the household about him fell for a few days into the low, careful hush that came in that century whenever a birth arrived early. His mother was Alexandra, the young Princess of Wales, only 20 years old and lately come to England from the small courts of Denmark, and his father was Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, eldest son of Queen Victoria and heir to the throne of the United Kingdom. The child was so small that no proper linen had been prepared for him, and the women of the house are said to have wrapped him in cotton wool and improvised swaddling until the correct clothes could be sent for from the nurseries. His grandmother the Queen, still in the deep black of her long widowhood, hurried down from the great castle to see him, and the newspapers of the country carried the news within the day, and bells were rung across the empire for the birth of a boy who would one day, in the ordinary course of things, sit upon that throne himself. The baby was christened Albert Victor Christian Edward, and though the palace had chosen the 4 names with great care, honouring his grandfather Prince Albert, and his grandmother Queen Victoria, and his Danish grandfather King Christian, and his father the Prince of Wales, within the family he was almost from the first called by one name only, and that name was Eddy. To his mother he was Eddy from the earliest days of the nursery, and to his father the same, and when a small brother was born to him a year and a half later, at Marlborough House in London on the 3rd of June 1865, and christened George Frederick Ernest Albert, the 2 boys became to their parents simply Eddy and Georgie, and to their household simply the little princes. The brothers were kept together in one nursery, only 17 months apart, and were dressed alike, and taught alike, and photographed together in the sailor suits and velvet coats of the age, and they grew up more nearly as twins than as elder and younger, with all the closeness that gave them and all the difficulty it would later bring. Let me pause with you a moment, before we go any further into the childhood, because there is a small thing to hold in mind, and it will matter later. The 2 little princes were being raised inside a household that was itself unlike any other in the country. Their father, the Prince of Wales, was already, by the middle of the 1860s, a young man of great pleasures and great restlessness, forbidden by his mother the Queen from any real share in the work of government, and setting the tone for the fashionable set at Marlborough House with dinners and shooting parties and long trips abroad. Their mother, the Princess of Wales, was gentle, warm, adored by the country, and somewhat set apart from her husband's world by a growing deafness she had begun to inherit from her own mother. The nursery over which she watched was a soft and indulgent one, softer than the nurseries in which most royal children of that age were raised, and the little princes were kept close to their mother's skirts far longer than the strict tutors of the Queen thought right. This tenderness at the centre of Eddy's earliest years is worth setting down, because it shaped a boy who would always be at his ease with his mother and quietly uncertain in the harder rooms of his father's world. Now come with me, and let us follow the little princes through the great houses of their childhood, for they were not raised in one place, but between several, according to the season and the mood of the family. In the winters, the household lived at Marlborough House, the tall red-brick townhouse on Pall Mall in London, that the Prince of Wales had made his own, and the boys played in the great garden that ran behind it, and were taken on walks by their nurses in the park across the road. In the summers they moved with the family to Sandringham House, in the flat green country of Norfolk, which the Prince of Wales had bought as a private estate soon after his marriage, and there the boys learned to ride ponies along the sandy lanes and to shoot at rabbits in the beet fields, and were let run half wild across the lawns in a way that a stricter royal childhood would not have allowed. In the autumn, the household went north to Balmoral, in the Highlands of Scotland, to stay with their grandmother the Queen among the pines in the peat smoke, and there the boys walked out with their gillies in tweeds and thick socks, and learned to fish the small streams for trout. And in the spring, sometimes the family took the yacht across to the small kingdom of Denmark, to see their mother's father and mother at Copenhagen, and the two boys ran along the beach at Bernstorff with their many cousins, and were more nearly ordinary children on those trips than they were ever able to be at home. Yet even in that soft nursery from very early on, a difference began to show between the two brothers, and the household began quietly to notice it. Georgie, the younger, was sharp and quick and full of a small energy that his tutors could rely on. Eddy, the elder, was slower and dreamier and given to long silences and to gazing out of the windows at the trees, and although his kindness was much remarked upon and his gentleness never in question, his ability to hold a lesson in his head had begun already to worry those who watched over him. He may have inherited some of his mother's deafness, though never so much of it, and his hearing seems to have been dull enough that lessons half heard in a warm room by an already sleepy boy left little behind them when the tutor closed his book. He was affectionate, patient with his brother and with his little sisters, for the family had grown by the middle of the 1870s to include the princesses Louise and Victoria and Maud. But he was not a boy who took easily to the schoolroom, and by the age of 7, his father, the Prince of Wales, had begun to speak of him, in letters to the Queen, in tones of quiet worry. Come and stand with me in one of those schoolrooms, and see the arrangement that grew from that worry, because it was to shape the whole first half of Eddy's life. In 1871, a young Cambridge clergyman named John Neil Dalton was appointed tutor to the two little princes at Sandringham, and from that year until the middle of the 1880s, Mr. Dalton would scarcely be out of Eddy's sight. Dalton was 32 years old at his appointment, a clever and pious man of ordinary origins, and he took his duties with the gravity of one who understood that the shaping of a future king was placed in his hands. He set the boys to Latin and to French, and to arithmetic and to scripture in the small schoolroom at Marlborough House, and to the same subjects in the schoolroom at Sandringham when the family moved north for the summer, and he grew steadily more concerned that Eddy could not be got, however hard he tried, to keep up with his younger brother. In his careful private reports to the Prince of Wales, Dalton described the elder boy as gentle, sweet-natured, willing, and yet strangely absent, as if his mind moved always half a step behind the lesson and could not be persuaded to catch it up. It was Dalton who first proposed the arrangement that would keep the two boys together into their young manhood, and it was, in its own way, a kindness born of that concern. If Eddy could not be trusted to keep up in a schoolroom, Dalton argued in a memorandum to the Prince of Wales in 1877, then perhaps he would learn better at sea, where duty and the presence of his brother might do what books alone could not. In the autumn of that year, the two boys, aged 13 and 12, were sent as naval cadets aboard the training ship HMS Britannia at Dartmouth, and were housed in the same cabin, and were required to share the same routine of drill and lessons and holy-stunning the deck as the sons of country parsons and half-pay officers who made up most of the intake. It was the first time in either boy's life that he had lived away from his mother, and the first time that he had been asked to answer to a bell rung by a stranger, and the letters home from Eddy in that first year were full of a quiet sadness that his mother, the Princess of Wales, kept, and later cherished. From Britannia, the two boys, still under the eye of Mr. Dalton, went on to a longer training aboard the corvette HMS Bachant, and for 3 years, from 1879 to 1882, they sailed as midshipmen through waters their grandmother, the Queen, had never seen. The Bachant carried them to the West Indies and to South America, and around the Cape of Good Hope to Australia, and up through the Indian Ocean to Ceylon and to Singapore, and on to Hong Kong and to Japan, and home at last through the Suez Canal, and in every port they were saluted and dined and toasted, and in every stretch between the ports they were made to stand watch and to work the ropes with the ordinary crew. When the two brothers returned to England as young men of 18 and 16, Eddy had grown very tall and very slim, so tall that a nickname was made of it in the family, though never used harshly, and his manners were quiet and gentle, and his father, the Prince of Wales, was not quite sure what to make of him. He was old enough now to be sent, at last, to a university, and old enough to be given an officer's commission in one of the smart cavalry regiments, and both of these arrangements were duly made, Eddy went up to Trinity College, Cambridge in the autumn of 1883 and was gazetted into the 10th Hussars soon after. And yet at neither of them did he seem quite to take, and his tutors and his colonel wrote of him afterwards, in the same careful phrases, always kind, always painfully disappointed. Let us slow a moment, you and I, and see the young man plainly, for it is important that we see him without the shadow that others would afterwards throw across him. In 1888, in the same year that the Whispering of Whitechapel was searching for a face, Eddy was 24 years old and living the quiet, half-idle life of an elder son of the heir to the throne. He was very tall, over 6 feet, thin, elegantly dressed in the high-starched collars and long lounge coats of the young men of his class, gentle in his address to servants and to strangers, easily bored by long lessons, uneasy at large parties, and warmly attached to his brother and to his mother. His friends at Trinity remembered him for a quiet kindness, and for a habit of walking alone by the river in the afternoons, and for a shyness that never quite lifted. His fellow officers at Aldershot remembered him for the same shyness, and for an aversion to the rougher entertainments of the mess, and for the faintly puzzled look with which he seemed sometimes to greet the ordinary business of a cavalry regiment. He was not remembered by any of them, for cruelty or for temper or for any darkness of the mind. He was, in the tender word his mother used most often of him in her letters, gentle. Come, and stand with me in the doorway of one of his rooms and see how he lived. At Cambridge, his rooms were in Nevile's Court, at Trinity, and there he kept a large soft-eyed retriever and a few sporting prints on the wall, and a small pile of unopened books on the table by the window. His personal tutor at Trinity was a brilliant and troubled young Don named James Kenneth Stephen, some 7 years older than Eddy, who had been a great figure at Eton and Cambridge in his day, and who now took an easy affection for his gentle royal pupil. Under Stephen's care, Eddy was set to read modern history and law, and though he applied himself as best he could, his hearing and his slowness at books did not improve, and Stephen wrote to the household with the same careful phrases the Reverend Dalton had used before him. That the young prince was kind and willing and slow. When the terms ended, Eddy went home to Sandringham or to Marlborough House, or on to the 10th Hussars at Aldershot, and there he shared a room with his valet, and kept a small photograph of his mother on his writing desk, and dressed for parade at 6 in the morning, and stood the drill of a junior cavalry officer with the same quiet patience he had shown at everything. Now, if you will, walk with me to a window in one of those quiet rooms at Sandringham in the last weeks of that same autumn of 1880, and stand there a moment, for it is important that we hold in our minds an image of the young man before any story was ever put upon him. Beyond the window the flat Norfolk fields ran away toward the sea in the grey November light, and the trees along the drive stood bare, and the smoke of the great house rose straight into the still air. In the room a fire burned steady in the grate, and the tall thin young man in a long tweed jacket stood at the window with his hands folded behind his back, and looked out at the fields, and did not speak. He was 24 years old, and second in line to the throne of the largest empire the world had known. His name was Eddy to those who loved him, and Albert Victor to the world, and the tutors and colonels who had watched him grow had found him gentle, uncertain, kind, and slow. He had never been to Whitechapel in his life, and the parish that at that hour was walking its streets in fear of a face it could not see had never spoken his name, not once in any of its whispering, and would not do so for many years. Along the drive a groom led a chestnut mare slowly toward the stables, her breath rising white into the cold, and the young man at the window watched her go, and stood at the glass a little longer, and did not turn. Chapter 5. The Cleveland street shadow come away with me from that quiet window at Sandringham, from the tall thin young man in his tweed jacket, and the chestnut mare walking home along the drive. And let us follow him through the last 4 years of his short life, because those are the years the whispering would one day pick up and turn to its own uses. To see how a false story could ever be sewn onto him, you must first walk with him through the small ordinary rooms and small ordinary difficulties of a young prince who was, by the account of everyone who truly knew him, gentler than the age he had been born into, knew quite what to do with. By the summer of 1885, when Eddy was 21, the family had begun to accept a truth that his tutors had long tried to soften in their reports, that Cambridge had not been able to teach him what a modern Cambridge was meant to teach a young man, and that the small quiet retreat of Trinity College and the affectionate care of James Kenneth Stephen had not turned him into the sort of scholar prince his grandmother the Queen had once hoped for. He came down from the university at the end of 2 years without a degree, which was the usual arrangement for princes of the blood, and his father, the Prince of Wales, after long conversation with the Queen, decided that the army must be tried next in earnest, in the hope that the routine and the plain company of officers might give him the shape he had not found in books. So in June of 1885, Eddy was gazetted a lieutenant in the 10th Royal Hussars, one of the smartest and most fashionable cavalry regiments in the whole of the British service, and he took up his commission in earnest at the great garrison town of Aldershot in Hampshire. Let us slow the pace, you and I, and stand a moment on the edge of the parade ground at Aldershot in that summer, because it is here that Eddy first stepped into a world in which the young men around him were entirely unlike the tutors and cousins and gentle household ladies he had known. The 10th Hussars in the 1880s were a regiment of very rich young officers, mostly sons of peers and great landowners, who kept their own hunters in the officers' stables, and who dined each evening in a mess whose plate was heavier than that of many small country houses, and who were expected to spend a good part of their pay on wine and cards, and on the small polished spurs and gold braid that made up the peacock uniform of the regiment. The day began at reveille with the trumpet call at 5:30, and their first parade was at 6, with the horses fed and rubbed down, and by 7 they had ridden the drill on the great sandy ground behind the barracks, and by 9 they had breakfasted in the mess, and by 11 they were back at the horses or at the schools of the riding master. In the evenings the mess uniform was blue with gold cording, and the wine was set on a long table by the mess sergeant himself, and the young officers were expected to sit late and to laugh at the coarse and confident stories of their fellows. Come and stand behind the tall thin lieutenant at his place at that table, and see how uneasily he sat there. Eddy did his best, by every account we have, and the letters of his fellow officers were kind about him, and his colonel found him willing and polite, but he was not made for the boisterous evenings of the mess, and his hearing, which had never been strong, made the loud rooms and the ringing glass and the constant laughter tiring for him beyond what his fellows understood. He was slow at the mess talk and slow at the jokes, and he took his wine sparingly, and he preferred to slip away after an hour, to sit alone with a novel or with a letter half written to his mother. On horseback he was better, for his long thin legs sat a horse, well, and he had ridden since he was small at Sandringham, and on the drills of the regiment he could give a plain steady account of himself. But the small daily social business of a smart cavalry mess, the sort of thing his brother Georgie would have carried lightly, sat heavy on him at Aldershot, and after a year at the depot his father, the Prince of Wales, was already looking about for a way to move him gently elsewhere. Through the middle years of the 1880s then, Eddy's life took on a shape it would keep until nearly the end. In the winters he was at Aldershot with the regiment, or on light garrison duty when the 10th Hussars were sent up to York for a season, or at Hounslow, just outside London, when a squadron of the regiment was posted there. In the summers he was at Sandringham with his family, walking the beet fields with his brother and shooting rabbits along the drives, or up at Balmoral for the shooting parties of his grandmother the Queen. In between, from time to time, he was sent on long tours abroad in the interest of the Empire, for it was thought that travel would settle him, and would allow him to be shown to the peoples his family would one day rule. In the autumn of 1885 he was sent on a long tour of Ireland, in the company of a small suite of officers and gentlemen, and was received quietly at Dublin Castle and at court. In the winter of 1886 he sailed for Germany and Austria, and was received at the courts of his many royal cousins there. And in the autumn of 1889 he was sent on a longer and more ambitious tour of British India, which would last until the following spring, and take him from Bombay to Calcutta, to Madras and Aid, in Liverpool-Kinfkinamalabandied. By the government to hand cat, it come with me back to the London of 1888 and 1889, because it is in those 2 years, and in a small quiet street of the West End called Cleveland Street, that the story we are following makes its first careful turn. Cleveland Street ran between Tottenham Court Road and Fitzroy Square, in the parish of Marylebone, and it was a street of narrow 4-storey brick houses of the last century, some let out to lodgers and some given over to small workshops and shops. At number 19, in the summer of 1889, the proprietor of a small telegraph and messenger service kept a set of rooms above the ground floor, and it was in these rooms that a scandal now broke that would spread outward through the West End and the newspapers of the country, and touch, at its farthest edge, the household of the Prince of Wales. Let us slow the story here, because the Cleveland Street affair is complicated, and it matters to keep it plain. On the 4th of July that summer, a 15-year-old telegraph boy from the General Post Office named Charles Swinskow was searched by a constable at his office in the West Central District and was found to be carrying 14 shillings in his pocket, which was a great deal of money for a boy of his rank and more than 3 weeks of his wages. Under questioning at the office and afterwards at Marlborough Street Police Station, Swinskow told the constable that he had earned the money at a house in Cleveland Street, where he and other telegraph boys had been paid a shilling or two by gentlemen for going upstairs with them. The house of number 19 was raided, its proprietor arrested, and its books and correspondence carried away by the police. What the books contained, and what the boys under further questioning began to tell, was that a number of very well-known men had used the house, among them officers of the guards and members of the aristocracy, under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which had made all sexual acts between men in England a criminal offence punishable by up to 2 years' hard labour. Every one of these men now stood in danger of ruin, and the investigation moved slowly and quietly through July and August of that year, as the Home Office weighed how far it dared to press it. Come with me into the small back parlour of a Marlborough Street police court in the last week of August, because it is here, in a whispered word from an informant, that Eddy's name first entered the story, though only at the very edge of it, and never in a way that any court or paper of the time could prove. The informant, one of the boys at the house, told the constables that among the gentlemen who had used the rooms was a certain Prince Eddy, and although he had never seen the prince himself, and could only give a second-hand tale, the constable wrote the name down. This one small note, made in a police court book that was never meant to be read by the country, was what generations of later writers would seize on and blow to a size it never truly had. Within the police and within the Home Office, the mention was taken seriously enough to be discussed by the Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Augustus Stevenson, and by the Attorney General, Sir Richard Webster, and by the Home Secretary Henry Matthews himself, and in the papers that survive from those weeks it is plain that great care was taken to make sure the Prince's name never appeared in the open court. His equerry, Lord Arthur Somerset, who was a major in the Royal Horse Guards and the head of the Prince of Wales's stables, did have his name in the books of the house, and did quietly leave the country for the continent in the autumn of that year, and was never brought back to face trial, though a warrant was later issued against him. Whether Eddy himself ever set foot in the house at number 19 is a question that the surviving record does not, in truth, settle in either direction. Let us stand for a moment in that uncertainty, because it is the ground on which so much later rumour would be built. In the papers of Henry James Fitzroy, Earl of Euston, who sued a small radical paper for libel that October, when it named him as one of the customers of the house, and in the papers of Lord Arthur Somerset in his exile, and in the private letters of the Prince of Wales to his son and to his ministers, one finds a constant careful skirting of the Prince's name. In one of those letters, written by Somerset from Homburg to a friend at home, he speaks with regret of the young man who had been made to suffer for the errors of others. And in the private diaries of Sir Darton Promin, the Prince of Wales's controller, who took Eddy quietly on a short trip to the country during the worst weeks of the scandal, there is a note that the family had been made anxious by things being said in the clubs. All of this taken together suggests that talk about the Prince had begun to move through the smoking rooms of London, and that his father and his household believed some of that talk might spread, and that they moved with careful speed to keep him out of the case. What it does not amount to, on any honest reading, is proof that Eddy was a customer of the house, or that he had had any part in what was going on there. Come, and let us walk a small way out of Cleveland Street itself, and into the wider question of Eddy's private life, because it matters to see the plain shape of it before we set it down. In the smoking rooms of the West End, and in the private letters of a number of his contemporaries, it was said that the young prince was, in the careful language of the age, of the same tastes as some of the customers of number 19. His old Cambridge tutor, James Kenneth Stephen, still a close friend, wrote him letters of a warmth that some later historians have thought went beyond the ordinary. His fellow officers in the 10th Hussars noted his shyness with women, and his apparent lack of the appetites of a young cavalry officer of that day, and a small handful of his letters, which survive in the Royal Archives, speak of male friends in tones that a strict Victorian reader would have found troubling. Yet an equal number of his letters speak with warmth of young women he had met at country houses, and he formed at least 3 serious attachments to eligible princesses through the middle of the 1880s, and he seems in the end to have been a young man of gentle affections given easily and widely, whose exact private life was, then as now, largely his own. What can be said with certainty is that he was gentle, he was shy, he was uncertain in company, and he was never, in any surviving record, cruel to any living creature. Let us come at last to the year we most care about, because it is the pivot on which the later whispering would turn. In the autumn of 1888, while the parish of Whitechapel walked the courts with its lanterns and its whistles, Eddy was not in London at all, and this is a matter not of family memory, but of plain public record set down in the court circulars of that year, which the newspapers of the country printed each morning as a matter of course. In the last week of August, when Mary Ann Nichols was killed in Bucks Row, Eddy was at a country lodge called Dandy Lodge at Grandtown-on-Spey in Scotland, and then at Danby Lodge near Grosmont in Yorkshire, staying with the friends of his family for the shooting on the moors, and the court circular for the 29th of August through the 7th September. Record circular for the 29th of August through the 7th of September records his presence there in the plain, unadorned prose that court officials used every day. In the first week of September, when Annie Chapman was killed in Hanbury Street, Eddy was on official duty at the cavalry barracks in York, on the routine business of his regiment, and the court circular records his review of the horses there on the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th. On the last night of September, when Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddows were killed in Berners Street and Mitre Square, Eddy was in Scotland at the great Highland house of Abergeldy Castle, which stood on the Balmoral estate and had been placed at the Prince of Wales's use by the Queen, and the circular for the whole of the month places him with his family among the fir trees and the peat smoke of the north. Come and stand a moment in the great hall at Abergeldy in that first cold week of October, because it is important to hold this picture beside the darker one. The whispering would one day try to lay across it. The lamps were lit early in the north, and the tall shuttered windows looked out onto the black shape of the pines beyond the drive, and a fire of birch and peat burned in the grate. The Queen herself would come and go from the neighbouring castle at Balmoral through the days that followed, in her deep black bombazine and her white widow's cap, walking slowly on the arm of her Highland servant John Brown's successor, and Eddy would sit with her at tea in the little parlour and hear her speak, as she often did, of the government of the country and of the wickedness of the age. Outside, in the paddocks, his own hunter was rubbed down after the day's shooting. Inside, at his writing table, he sat quietly and answered a letter from his mother in the small, unsure handwriting his tutors had never managed to strengthen. It was, in every sense, an ordinary autumn at a great country house of the era, and the parish of Whitechapel, which lay 600 miles to the south, was not once mentioned in the circular, or in any letter he sent that month. Let us pause here, you and I, on the low stone step outside the great hall at Abergeldy, and hold the ordinariness of the picture a little longer, because it is the ordinariness that later writers would need to make disappear. In the picture there is a tall, thin young man in a tweed jacket, lighting a cigarette against the chill, and looking out at the shape of the hills. There is his mother, the Princess of Wales, sitting in the small parlour with her needlework and her deftness and her love for her elder son. There is his grandmother, the Queen, coming and going in her low pony carriage between Abergeldy and Balgeld, and calling him softly in for tea. There are the pines above the roofline and the wet leaves on the lawn, and the smell of peat smoke on the collar of a coat. In all of this, there is nothing but a young officer at rest with his family in the north, at a time when the newspapers of the south were beginning to shout of murder in a parish he had never seen. This is the plain fact of where he was, and it is important to hold it before we walk into the last 2 years of his life, and into the winter of his death, and into all that would afterwards be built on his empty chair. Along the paddock rail at Abergeldy, a stable boy in a coarse jacket led the tall hunter home in the fading light, the horse's breath rising white above the fence, and the lamp of the small lodge at the drive was lit and set in its window, and the young man on the step turned from the hills and went slowly indoors. Tip. Chapter 6. The fever at Sandringham. Come with me, then, from that lamp in the lodge window at Abergeldy, through the 2 years that lay between it and the last quiet room of Eddy's life. For those 2 years must be walked briskly, if we are to keep faith with the young man himself. It is easy, when one knows how a story ends, to hurry past the ordinary hours that came before the ending, and Eddy's ordinary hours have too often been hurried past by writers with other things on their minds. Let us not do that. Let us take these 2 years at their own pace, the pace of the person who was living them, without knowing what was coming. Through the end of 1888 and the whole of 1889, Eddy carried on the same quiet round of his life that we have already walked with him. The drills at Aldershooting, the shooting parties at Sandringham, the long visits to Balmoral, the small stays at Marlborough House when Parliament was sitting, the Cleveland Street affair, which broke into the papers in the November of 1889, brushed past his household in the careful way we have already seen, and moved on without ever settling on him in the open, and by the spring of 1890 the papers had turned to other matters, and the whispering about him in the clubs had thinned again. In the same spring, his father, the Prince of Wales, in agreement with the Queen, arranged for him to be sent on the long official tour of British India that had been discussed for years, and in the last week of September in 1889 he sailed from Portsmouth aboard the mail steamer Bombay for the subcontinent his family had come to rule, and would not have imagined they could ever lose. Let us pause a moment on the deck of that mail steamer, because it is one of the small pleasures of Eddy's story that we can, for once, see him in the plain unguarded shape of a young traveller. He was 25 that autumn, and dressed in the white ducks and light jacket that officers were told to wear for the passage through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. He was thin, tall, sunburnt within a week of leaving Malta, quiet at the officers' table in the saloon, and given to walking the deck alone in the evenings with a small volume of poetry in his hand. He kept up a steady correspondence home, and the letters he sent to his mother from Aden and Bombay and Calcutta and Rangoon are gentle and observant, and full of small careful sentences about the light on the water and the birds he had seen at each port and the manners of the servants of the great houses he had stayed in. He is not, in these letters, a young man in any kind of moral or private crisis. He is a young officer on a long official tour, doing his best to write down what he sees for a mother whom he loved. Come and walk with him through the tour itself, because it will help us set the plain young man of this year firmly in mind. Between the last week of October 1889 and the first week of May 1890, he travelled from Bombay to Hyderabad, and then across to Madras and up the eastern coast to Calcutta. He went on to Rangoon in Burma, up the great river Irrawaddy to Mandalay, and then back across the Bay of Bengal to receive the salutes of the small hill states of the subcontinent. He stayed with the Viceroy Lord Lansdowne at Government House in Calcutta for the great Christmas review of the troops, and afterward upped into the full tillage to Kyle Coldudes of the Bepaulaith. Everywhere he was received in the full pomp of the empire, the great state elephants of the Nizam of Hyderabad, the artillery salutes at every port, the ceremonial banquets under punkahs swung slowly by unseen servants on a corded rope, and everywhere he behaved with a quiet politeness that the older officers of his suite thought highly of. And everywhere he behaved with a quiet politeness that the older officers of his suite thought highly of. His hearing troubled him at the crowded banquets, and his shyness troubled him at the balls of the Residency at Calcutta. But he did what was asked of him without complaint, and his colonel wrote home to the Prince of Wales that the young man was showing better than had been hoped. Now come with me back to England in the summer of 1890, because it is here that the last shape of Eddy's short life began to gather itself around him. He returned home in early May, sunburnt and thinner than he had gone, and was received by his mother at Marlborough House with the quiet joy she reserved for him alone. The papers noted his return kindly, and the Queen sent him a warm note of welcome, and he took a short rest at Sandringham through the beginning of the summer. Yet in the same weeks letters were passing quietly between the Queen and the Prince of Wales, and between the Prince of Wales and the Home Secretary, on a question that had come to trouble the family through the 2 years of the Cleveland Street affair and the long absences of India. The question, that is, of how the young man's future was now to be arranged. It was thought that he must be given work he could hold, and a marriage he could be steadied by, and both were now taken up in earnest. Let us slow the pace, you and I, and stand a moment inside the private room at Windsor Castle where the Queen kept her writing desk in the summer of 1890, because the letters written from that desk in those months tell us a good deal about the affection with which Eddy was held by his own family. The Queen had at first found her elder grandson slow and disappointing, and had said so in her plain way in earlier years. But through the last of the 1880s she had come to feel a tender concern for him, and her letters of that summer speak of him with a warmth that is very different from her earlier reserve. She wrote to her daughter, the Empress Frederick of Germany, that Eddy was a very kind and dear boy, who had never done anyone any harm, and she wrote the Prince of Wales that she was more anxious than she could say to see him settled with a good wife who would understand him. 2 young princesses were considered. First, Princess Alix of Hesse, who was to become the last Empress of Russia, and who refused Eddy quite firmly in the summer of 1890 because she loved another, and then Princess Helene of Orleans, who Eddy came to love in earnest and to wish very much to marry, but whose Catholic faith and whose French royal family stood in the way. Through the second half of 1890 and the whole of 1891, the young prince carried a private grief about Helen that he did not much speak of, and his mother, the Princess of Wales, bore it with him, and his letters of that year are the shortest and least easy of all he wrote. Come and stand at the window of the drawing-room at Marlborough House in the autumn of 1891, because it is here that the last arrangements of his life began. In the autumn of that year, at the urging of the Queen and of his own family, and after much thought, Eddy asked for and received the hand of another young princess who had grown up quietly in the shadow of the family, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, called May by her family, the daughter of Prince Francis of Teck, and of the Queen's cousin, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. Princess May was 24 that autumn, tall, clever, sensible, careful with money, and much loved by the Queen. She had known Eddy since they were children playing together in the great houses of the family, and she agreed to the match with a serious kindness that was very like her. The engagement was announced on the 3rd of December 1891, and the papers of the country carried the news the following morning, and the country in general took the match kindly. The wedding was to be held on the 27th of February 1892 at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, and through the last weeks of 1891 the household of Marlborough House was busy with the small careful business of a great royal wedding. The invitations sent to the courts of Europe, the trousseau ordered from Paris and from the great London dressmakers, the plate and linen laid aside, the settlements drawn up by the solicitors and lawyers of both families. Let us slow now, you and I, because the last week of that story is a small, quiet thing that has to be walked at the pace of the days that made it. On Christmas Eve of 1891, Eddy travelled with his family from London to Sandringham for the family Christmas, which was the great yearly gathering of the Prince of Wales's household, and Princess May travelled up separately with her own family and was there to greet him. The great house at Sandringham stood in the flat country of Norfolk, about 8 miles from the coast, and it had been rebuilt by the Prince of Wales in the 1870s in a heavy red brick and white stone style that made it feel more like a large country hotel than the seat of a royal family. The rooms were kept very warm by fires in every grate and by the great steam radiators that the Prince of Wales had installed as one of the newest comforts of the age, and the corridors smelt of the pine wood of the great Christmas tree in the ballroom, and of the flowers sent up each morning from the estate glass houses, and of the wet tweed of coats hung up in the boot rooms. The whole household had gathered, Eddy and his brother Prince George, their sisters the Princesses Louise, Victoria and Maud, their mother the Princess of Wales, their father the Prince of Wales, Princess May with her parents, and a small group of close friends and cousins from the German and Danish courts. Come and see the days as they went. On Christmas Day itself the whole party attended the small parish church of St. Mary Magdalene, which stood at the edge of the estate and had been the family's church since the Prince of Wales had bought the property. And afterwards there was the great family lunch in the long dining room, with the Prince of Wales at the head of the table in his high starched collar and his careful tie, and the household staff bringing in the turkey and the plum pudding under the covers of the silver dishes. In the afternoon the party walked out in the winter light along the drives, and Eddy walked with Princess May and spoke with her softly about their future together, and there is a photograph from the first week of that January in which the two of them stand side by side on the terrace with the wet stone of the house behind them and a small careful hope in both of their faces. On the 8th of that month it was Eddy's 28th birthday, and the household kept it as a quiet family day, and there was a small evening dinner in his honour, and his mother, the Princess of Wales, gave him a photograph of herself in a silver frame, which he took up to his room and set on the table beside his bed. Let us slow the story further, because what came next was the plainest kind of story, and it must be told plainly. The winter of that year had already brought a great wave of the influenza to England, which the papers had been calling the Russian flu since it had first appeared in the east of Europe 2 winters before. The sickness moved through the country in a hard, steady way, and by the beginning of 1892 it had reached into every parish of the kingdom. The hospitals in London were crowded, the death rate had climbed sharply, and even in the great country houses of the shires, servants and family alike were falling ill in numbers that frightened the doctors. On the 4th of January, the day after his birthday, Eddy went out with the guns on the estate at Sandringham for a small shoot in the hard cold air, and by the evening he was feverish, and by the following morning he could not rise from his bed. The physicians who came from London, Dr. Manby of the town nearby, and Sir Francis Laking, the family physician, and Dr. Broadbent, a fashionable London consultant, agreed at once that it was influenza, which had already begun to pass through the servants of the household, and they gave him the usual treatments of the day, which were quinine and beef tea and hot poultices and steam. Come and stand a small distance away from the door of his bedroom, because it is important to hold the last week of his life in the plain, quiet shape it truly had. His room at Sandringham was on the first floor, above the family drawing rooms, and it had a small fire in the grate and a heavy curtain drawn across the window against the light, and a table beside the bed on which stood the silver frame with his mother's picture and a small glass of water. Through the first days of his illness the household went on outwardly as it had before. The shooting party still went out, though quietly, and the meals were still served in the long dining room. But by the 11th of January the physicians had given warning that the influenza had turned to pneumonia, and by the 12th the whole house had drawn itself in about his room. His mother, the Princess of Wales, sat with him almost constantly through those last 4 days, holding his thin hand in both of hers, and reading aloud to him from the small prayer book he had carried since his childhood. His father, the Prince of Wales, came and went from the room in a slow, uncertain grief that was very unlike the man the country knew. His brother George sat at the foot of the bed for hours at a time and spoke to him softly of the old days at sea. And Princess May, who had been present through the whole of the illness, sat in a small chair by the heart here, with her heart, let us slow to the pace of a held breath, because the 14th of January, 1892, at a little after 9 in the morning, was the hour at which Eddy died. The physicians made no attempt to keep back the moment or to hide it from the family. They had told the household in the small hours that there was no more that could be done, and the room had been kept quiet through the last night, with only the small ticking of the mantel clock and the soft breathing of the young man in the bed. His mother sat on one side of him and his father on the other, and his brother stood at the foot, and Princess May sat with her hands on the counterpane at the side. He was 28 years old and second in line to the throne of the largest empire the world had known, and his last words, as remembered by his mother and set down in the letter she wrote that afternoon to the Queen, were the plain, quiet words of a gentle and half-conscious man who called for a friend and for his brother and for her, and then he was gone, and the ticking of the mantel clock went on in the room by itself. Come away with me quietly from that doorway, because the days that followed carried the plain grief of a family and a country, and they too must be walked with respect. The Prince of Wales sent a telegram to the Queen at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and to the courts of Europe, and to the newspapers of London. And by the afternoon of that same day, the great bells of every church in the country were beginning to toll for the death of the heir to the heir. The papers came out with black borders around their columns, and the shop windows of London were dressed in black. And at Sandringham, the household went about in the plain black bombazine and dark suits that the age laid down for such an hour. Eddy's body was laid in his own bedroom for 2 days, dressed in the uniform of the 10th Hussars, and then carried down through the long corridors of the great house to a small ante-chapel where the members of the household and the estate came in slow single file to say their goodbyes. On the 20th of January, a Wednesday, his coffin was placed on a gun carriage draped in the royal standard and drawn slowly by the horses of the 10th Hussars along the drive to the small parish church of St. Mary Magdalene, where his family had gone to Christmas service only 3 weeks before, and there the first small family service was held, and afterwards the coffin was taken by train to Windsor, where he was buried in St. George's Chapel on the same day, in the presence of the Queen and of the whole family. He was 28 years old, and he was much loved by those who knew him, and he was gentle to the last, and the parish of Whitechapel, in that same week, was still walking its courts under the same lamps and along the same wet stones as it had walked them 3 years before. And no one in the parish, and no one in any newspaper in the country, in that week of black-bordered columns and tolling bells, had yet spoken his name in the same breath as the name that had by then been given to the darkness there. Ah. Chapter 7. The long silence come away with me, then, from the small parish church at Sandringham and from the great cold chapel at Windsor. And let us walk together across the years that followed his burial, because it is the long silence of those years that must be understood before the whispering could ever come back for him. Silence, in the story we are following, is not empty. It is a long, low room in which a story can rest and gather dust, and be picked up again by hands the first hands could never have imagined. Let us walk into that long, low room now at the slow pace it truly kept. In the weeks after Eddy's funeral, the country carried the death of the young prince, the way it carried all such deaths in that age, with a quiet formal mourning that touched every household of any standing, and with a slower private mourning that lived on in the letters and the small rooms of the family for years afterward. The Queen ordered court mourning for 6 weeks in the deepest degree, and half-mourning for 6 weeks afterwards, and the ladies of every great house took out their heavy black bombazine, and their weeping veils and their small jet ornaments, and the gentlemen took out their crepe hat-bands and their black gloves, and the shop windows of the West End showed nothing but black and grey for the first month of that year. In the drawing-rooms of Marlborough House and of Sandringham, the mirrors were covered in dark cloth as the custom of the household required, and the clocks were stopped at the hour of the young man's death, and the small photograph in its silver frame that he had kept beside his bed was carried by his mother to her own room and set on the mantelpiece there, and would sit on that mantelpiece for the rest of her long life. The great settled shape of the family's mourning, however, was a different matter, and it moved through the following year in a way that changed the future of the country. Princess May of Teck, the young woman who had been engaged to Eddy at the time of his death, remained close to the family through the whole of that year of black and grey, and travelled with the Prince and Princess of Wales on their spring visit to the south of France, and was much comforted by them, and comforted them in return. In the summer of 1892, the household of the family began quietly to consider whether Princess May, so evidently suited to the work of a queen consort, and so much loved by the Queen herself, might yet marry Prince George, the younger brother, on whom the succession had now fallen. Prince George was made Duke of York in the spring of that year, and given the household and the establishment his brother would have had, and in the following spring, on the 6th of May 1893, he and Princess May became engaged. They were married on the 6th of July of that same year at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, in the same chapel where Eddy would have been married the year before. And Princess May of Teck became the Duchess of York, and would in time become the Queen Mary who would be seen by many of the older listeners still watching this channel today. The story of the family, in this way, closed quietly over the small grave at Windsor, and the boy who had been the elder brother slipped, in the ordinary course of the years, into the position of a photograph on his mother's mantelpiece. Let us walk out now with the country from the year of the funeral into the long decade that followed, because it was in that decade that the memory of the murders themselves began to change, and the parish of Whitechapel to be remade in ways the parish of 1880 would scarcely have recognised. In the November of 1892, still less than a year after the death of the prince, the last of the great files of the Metropolitan Police on the murders was closed without an arrest, and Sir Robert Anderson at Scotland Yard, in his private notes wrote that the murderer had been a poor Polish Jew of the East End who had been placed in an asylum soon after the murders had stopped. The name he had in mind, and which he never publicly gave, was almost certainly a man called Aaron Kosminski, who had been detained in the workhouse at Mile End in July of 1890, and moved to Colney Hatch Asylum in the following February. Kosminski, in the plain surviving records of the asylum, was a quiet, harmless, and severely disordered man of 30, who suffered from hallucinations and who lived out the rest of his life at the Leavesden Asylum, where he died in 1819. Sir Melville Macnaghten of the Yard, in his private memorandum of 1894, gave 3 names as possible suspects: a barrister named Montague John Druitt, who had drowned himself in the Thames within weeks of the last murder; a Polish Jew called Kosminski, who fitted the same description Anderson had in mind; and a Russian doctor called Michael Ostrog, of whom little was ever proved. Each of these men was very poor, very obscure, and very far from any royal palace, and the Yard, on the plain evidence available to it, had no doubt at all that the killer had come from the parish itself, and not from the great houses of the West End. Come with me a little further, and stand a moment above the streets of Whitechapel through the last years of the 1890s, because the ground on which the story had happened was itself beginning to change. The Peabody Trust and the East End Dwellings Company and the Rothschild Buildings project. Great housing schemes started by rich reforming families in the years before and after the murders began to buy up the worst of the rookeries and to pull them down, court by court, and to raise in their place tall block dwellings of yellow brick with iron balconies and clean stairs and running water. Dorset Street, which had been the worst of the streets in 1888, was renamed Duval Street in the early years of the new century, and afterwards partly cleared and rebuilt. Flower and Dean Street was demolished and replaced with the great Nathaniel dwellings and Charlotte the Rothschild dwellings, whose windows looked out onto a broader, plainer road. The rookery at the back of Hanbury Street was cleared for a brewery yard, and the small dark court of Miller's Court, where the last of the young women had died, was walled up and eventually built over entirely, and cannot today be found by anyone walking Dorset Street with the old maps in hand. The whispering that had run through those courts in the autumn of 1888 had by 1900 lost the walls between which it had run, and the parish that had been afraid was already becoming a parish that was, in a slow, steady way, being unbuilt around its own fear. Let us walk out again and see how the story travelled through the wider country in those quiet years. In the popular papers of the 1890s, the case still returned from time to time, chiefly when the anniversary of the murders came round, or when a fresh murder somewhere in the country raised the old comparison. And there was a period of alarm in the spring of 1891 when a woman called Frances Coles was killed in Swallow Gardens near Whitechapel, and for a few days the papers ran headlines asking whether the Ripper had returned. He had not. A sailor called James Sadler was arrested for the Coles murder, though never brought to trial for it, and after that spring the case slipped, without ceremony, out of the daily columns of the newspapers and into the slower and quieter category of the great unsolved crimes of the age. In the anthologies and case books that began to appear in the 1890s, such as George Sims's Mysteries of Modern London and the crime articles in the popular monthly magazines, the Ripper murders were told over from time to time with the same care and the same uncertainty, but the suspects named were always those the Yard had considered: poor men of the parish, obscure lodgers, foreign sailors, and no writer of that decade, or of the 2 decades that followed, ever thought to reach as far as a royal palace for the answer. Come with me now further into the 20th century, because the long silence of the story stretched into a stretch of years even greater than most who tell it remember. Through the whole of the reign of Edward VII, from 1901 to 1910, the case was still spoken of by the newspapers of the day, only as one of the great unsolved mysteries, and Sir Melville Macnaghten's careful private memorandum of 1894 remained the last serious official statement of the Yard's view of the case, and it stayed private. Through the reign of George V, that same Prince George who had been Eddy's younger brother, and who now sat on the throne with Queen Mary at his side, the case again did not return in any sensational way, and the country was in any event soon caught up in the Great War of the Western Trenches, in which so many of the men who had been children in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888 now died in the mud of France and Belgium. Through the reign of Edward VIII and afterwards through the reign of George VI, and into the years of the Second Great War and the rebuilding of London from the bombing, the case was mentioned from time to time in the popular press, but it had by then become something almost quaint, a Victorian story of fog and gaslight in a city that had by then quite forgotten what real fog was, and the parish of Whitechapel itself had lived through the Blitz of 1940, and had been rebuilt afterwards, and the parish of Whitechapel itself had lived through the 18, and had been rebathed of all the bit of quich quality. Let us slow, you and I, and stand for a moment in the middle of the 1950s, because it is here that we come to the point where the silence had grown deepest. In the London of 1953, when the young Queen Elizabeth II was crowned at Westminster Abbey, most of the people who had been alive in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888 were long dead, and the courts and the alleys they had walked in were, for the most part, no longer standing. The chief abbey of the day, whose community had been so nearly cast into a riot by the rioting in Galston Street in September of that lost year, sat now in a country whose Jewish East End was scattering out into the new suburbs of Ilford and Golders Green, leaving the old streets to the Bangladeshi families who would come to make them their own in the decades to follow. The great houses of the family, Marlborough House, Sandringham, Balmoral, Abergeldy, still stood, though under a different mistress and a different generation, and the photograph of Eddy in its silver frame still stood in the private rooms of Queen Mary at Sandringham, where she lived out her long widowhood until her death in 1953. and in the small quiet corner of the north side of the chapel at Windsor, where his marble tomb still stood, few visitors came to look at it, and fewer still knew who the tall young man asleep in the marble had once been meant to be. Come and stand a moment inside that chapel with me, on some ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1955, because it is one of the small good ways of feeling the shape of the silence he had by then fallen into. The chapel at Windsor was a working church of a working monarchy, and the ordinary business of the day went on around his tomb without ceremony. A verger in a black cassock moving quietly down the nave with a soft cloth in his hand. An old lady in a grey coat sitting in one of the choir stalls with her prayer book open in her lap. The light of the great west window falling in coloured squares on the stone flags of the floor. His tomb stood in the Albert Memorial Chapel to the east of the main body of the church. A great white marble figure of a young officer of the 10th Hussars laid out in the plain uniform of his regiment, with an angel in bronze weeping quietly at his head, and the sculptor Alfred Gilbert, who had made it, had taken so long over the work that he had almost bankrupted himself in the doing, and had to leave the country to escape his creditors, and had returned only in old age to finish it. Most of those who came into the chapel walked past the tomb without stopping, or stopped only for a moment to admire the workmanship of the angel, and did not read the name on the plaque at the young man's feet, and passed on toward the great memorial to his grandfather in the further chapel. This was the shape of the memory of Eddy through the middle of the 20th century. 3/4 of a century after the parish of Whitechapel had walked its courts by lantern light. A marble figure of a young officer whose name most passers-by no longer knew, in a chapel whose greatest attractions lay a little further along the aisle. Let us slow now to the very quietest pace of the story, because we have come to the last stretch of the silence before it broke. Through the 1950s in England, the crimes of the parish were no more than a small curiosity in a country whose imagination had by then been given other things to worry about. The recovery from the war, the loss of the empire, the coming of a new kind of housing to the East End, the ordinary getting through of ordinary lives. The old files of the H Division of the Metropolitan Police were locked in their boxes in the great vaults of the yard, and the private papers of Sir Melville Macnaughton, and of Sir Robert Anderson, and of Sir Charles Warren, sat in family drawers in country houses in Sussex and in Kent, and were read by no one but the sons and grandsons of those who had first written them. In the parish itself, the small pubs on Commercial Street, where the drinkers had once spoken the name of Leather Apron in low tones, still stood in some cases and had been repainted several times, and their landlords could no longer have told a visitor which stool had once been sat on by a witness at the Chapman inquest, or where in the room the Vigilance Committee of 1888 had held its first meetings. The photographs of the 5 women who had been lost had been printed in Sir Melville Macnaughton's memoir, and in 1 or 2 crime anthologies of the early years of the century, and had otherwise fallen out of the ordinary circulation of the papers and books, and were kept mostly in the boxes of the record offices, where a very few very patient researchers came from time to look at them, and in a small quiet office in Paris in the same 1950s, a young French writer of biography named Philippe Julien was sitting at a desk in the early evenings after his day's work, turning over the papers of the late Prince of Wales in his court for a book he was preparing on the reign of Edward VII, and coming across, for the first time, the small careful skirting of a name that had been done in the summer of 1889 around the affair at number 19 Cleveland Street, and setting a small pencilled question mark in the margin the Malbade had been done. Outside the window of his office, the street lamps of the Rue Bonaparte came on one by one along the wet pavement, and the last of the traffic thinned in the direction of the river, and the whispering that had gone quiet at the tomb of the young prince in his marble uniform stirred, faintly for the first time in more than 60 years, and did not yet know it had woken. Chapter 8. The whisper returns, come away with me from that small quiet office in the Rue Bonaparte, from the pencilled question mark in the margin of a young French writer's notes, and let us walk together into the strange, warm, careless years that followed, because it is here that the whispering that had gone quiet at the marble tomb in Windsor at last began to stir again. To understand how a story like this comes back, you must understand the room it comes back into, and the room in this case was not the fog-lit parish of 1888, but a bright and unquiet new age altogether, one that had begun to look on the settled shapes of the past with a fresh appetite for scandal. By the middle of the 1960s, the country in which Philippe Julien was writing had changed more in 10 years than it had in the previous 50, and the world beyond it had changed even more. The great empire that had once counted the parish of Whitechapel among its smallest streets was gone, and the small kingdoms of Europe had fallen or shrunk to shadows of themselves, and the settled respect for kings and queens that had marked the Victorian and Edwardian ages had thinned to a light and playful curiosity. In London and in Paris the young painted their houses in loud colours, and cut their hair in shapes their grandmothers would not have known, and read newspapers that spoke of the royal family in tones a Victorian court would have called impertinent. The great houses of the 1880s were being opened to the public for shillings at the gate, and their private rooms photographed for magazines, and their old scandals dug up from the family papers by a new kind of writer who wrote for a new kind of reader, who wrote for a new kind of reader. Into this loose, curious air the small pencilled question mark in Julian's margin fell like a match into dry straw, and though it took several years to catch, it was already burning. Come with me first to the small book that Julian brought out in 1962, a biography in French of King Edward VII, called Édouard Sept, which was published by Hachette in Paris, and which sold quietly through the winter of that year in the bookshops along the Seine. Julian was a serious researcher, and much of his book was a careful and affectionate portrait of the old king, drawing on the memoirs of the French society hostesses he had known, and on the private letters of the court, and on the newspapers of the 1880s and 1890s. But in one small paragraph near the middle of the book, buried in a chapter on the private troubles of the Prince of Wales in the last years before his accession, Julian wrote a single careful sentence in which he suggested, without any evidence at all, that some had thought the Duke of Clarence might have been the man behind the murders in Whitechapel. He gave no source for the suggestion. He named no witness. He offered no argument. He simply set the sentence down among the other sentences of his chapter, and passed on, and the book went to press. Let us slow a moment, you and I, because that sentence, though small and unsupported, was the first time in 70 years that the name of the young prince at Sandringham had been set beside the name of the killer at Whitechapel in any book of any reputable kind. The book itself was not much noticed in England at the time, for it was in French, and its subject was a king who had been dead for more than 50 years, and its author was not widely known outside literary Paris. But a copy of it sat on the shelves of the London Library, and another sat in the private collection of a retired English surgeon who was reading widely in Edwardian history for pleasure. And it was the surgeon, more than the writer, who was to carry the sentence out of its narrow shelf and into the wider world. Come and meet him, quietly, because he too was a gentleman in his own way, and it will do us no good to make him a villain. His name was Dr. Thomas Eldon Alexander Stowell, and he had been born in 1885 and was in his 80s when he first began to speak of the theory that would carry his name. He had trained as a surgeon at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, and had served in the Great War, and afterwards, in the middle years of the century, in a distinguished quiet practice, and he had retired to a house in the countryside near Cranley in Surrey, where he kept his books and his notes and a small collection of medical curiosities in a room he called his study. He was, by all who knew him in those late years, a courteous, careful, old-fashioned man, given to slow speech and to long pauses, and much respected in the small society of his village. He was also, and this is the small hinge on which our story turns, a member of a private dining club in London called Our Society, whose members had for many years amused themselves after their yearly dinner by taking up unsolved crimes of history and offering short-spoken papers on them, in the same easy way that other men of that age took up chess problems or the naming of wild flowers. Come with me, then, into the dining room of Our Society on the evening of the 18th of November 1960, because it was here that Dr. Stowell first offered his short paper, and here that the small quiet story of the theory truly began. The Society dined that year at the Naval Club on Hill Street in Mayfair, and after the plates had been cleared and the port set down, Dr. Stowell rose in his dark suit at the head of the long table and read aloud from a small typed manuscript he had prepared. He told his fellow members that he had come, in his long medical reading, to believe that the man who had killed the women of Whitechapel had been a certain young man of the highest rank, whom he did not yet wish to name in public. That this young man had contracted a great disease in his early travels, a disease of the mind and the blood together, which had by the year of the murders driven him into a state of periodic madness, and that his family and his household, knowing of the disease, had arranged for him to be quietly cared for in the years after store of, and had added aloud that it didn't help be taught. Dr. Stowell read his paper in the calm, gentle voice of a man setting out a hypothesis for the amusement of his friends, and at the end of it his fellow members clapped politely, as they always did, and the port was passed again, and the evening turned to other matters. Let us slow the pace, because it is important to see clearly the small, easy manner in which this all took place. Dr. Stow had told no newspaper what he was going to say. He had shown no evidence. He had, when pressed by a friendly member after the port, admitted that his reading of the case rested chiefly on a set of notes he claimed to have seen many years before, said to belong to Sir William Whitechapel, the great Victorian physician who had attended the royal family in the 1880s. Dr. Stow would not, then or afterwards, show these notes to anyone else, would not describe them in any detail, and would in the end never provide any evidence that they had ever existed. Yet the paper had been read, and among those present at the dinner that night were journalists and writers who took it away with them, and one of them, an American writer of popular history called Colin Wilson, made mention of it in an article he wrote soon after, and from that mention the whisper began, at last, to move. Come with me then through the 10 years that followed the little dinner at the Naval Club, because the whisper travelled slowly at first, and then all at once. Through the middle of the 1960s the theory sat in the pages of a few small history magazines, and in the footnotes of 1 or 2 crime anthologies, and was mentioned from time to time on the wireless by writers with a light hand for the strange, and it stayed the small private amusement of a small private circle. Dr. Stow himself did not seek publicity, and lived on quietly in Surrey, and continued to correspond with a handful of writers and researchers about his reading, and refused any suggestion that he name the young man he had in mind in print. Yet the letters he sent, and the small remarks he made in his careful old voice, began to be gathered up in the notes of the writers around him, and the name at the centre of them, though never quite spoken by him, was one the small circle could not fail to guess. Let us stand a moment inside one of those quiet correspondences, because the letters that Dr. Stow wrote in the middle of the decade to the writer Colin Wilson, and to 1 or 2 others, are the plain record of a hypothesis being handed on from a private paper to a public book. In these letters he named the young man he had in mind as S, and spoke of him only in careful medical language, but he described in enough detail the tours, the illnesses, and the family arrangements that no reader with any sense of the error could fail to see whom he meant. He also, and this was the great pivot, spoke openly of Sir William Gull, the royal physician, as having in his private papers the evidence for the diagnosis. Sir William Gull was a real man, a great figure at Guy's Hospital and at St. Bartholomew's, physician in ordinary to Queen Victoria, and the very picture of the Victorian medical establishment, and to place his private papers at the centre of the theory was to give it, for the first time, a shape that a working journalist could take seriously. What Dr. Stow did not say, in any letter or in any paper, was that no such papers had ever been shown to exist, and that the Gull family, when quietly asked by later researchers, denied any knowledge of them. Come with me then to the day the whisper truly broke. In the November of 1970, in the pages of a small serious magazine called The Criminologist, which was read chiefly by lawyers and by retired policemen and by a small band of amateur historians of crime, Dr. Stow at last set down in print, in an article he called simply Jack the Ripper, a solution, the theory he had been offering for a decade at the private dinners of our society. He was by then 85 years old, and in poor health, and he had at last let his friends persuade him that the case for his hypothesis ought to be put on the record. In the article he wrote, as he had always written, in the careful language of a physician, and he still gave the name of his young man only as S, and still declined to spell out whom he meant, but he described the young man's life in enough detail, his royal blood, his travels, his tour of the West Indies, his residence at Sandringham, his early and sudden death, that any reader with a Victorian peerage on the shelf beside the magazine could not fail to arrive at the name of Prince Albert Victor. Let us slow and see what happened next, because it is one of the small, tellingly modern turns of the story. The Criminologist had a small circulation, but a reporter for a London evening paper picked up the article within a day or 2 of its publication and wrote a short piece on it, under a headline that named the prince by name at once. The evening paper was read by the morning papers, and within a week the theory that had lived for 10 years at private dinners in Mayfair was on the front pages of every popular newspaper in the country. The morning of the 4th of November 1970, the readers of the London tabloids opened their papers on the way to work and saw, in large black letters, the suggestion that Queen Victoria's grandson had been the killer at Whitechapel, and the readers of the evening papers on the way home saw the same suggestion carried further, and the small careful hedging in Dr. Stow's article stripped away, and a plain story of madness and murder set in its place. Within the same week, the story had crossed the Atlantic and was being reprinted in the American papers, and within the month, it had reached Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and the name of the young man on the marble tomb at Windsor was, for the first time in his 90 years, being spoken aloud in kitchens and workplaces on 4 continents, in the same sentence as the name that had been given to the darkness in the fog. Come with me and stand a moment in the quiet cottage in Surrey where Dr. Stowell sat that November, because the small hinge of his own reaction is one of the honest things in the whole story. He was greatly upset by what the newspapers had made of his article. On the 5th of November he wrote a short, careful letter to the Times of London, in which he said, in as plain words as he could find, that he had at no time associated the late Duke of Clarence with the murderer at Whitechapel, and that the young man in his article was not to be understood as the prince. This careful correction was printed by the Times on the 9th of November at the bottom of a column deep inside the paper, and was read by very few and made no difference at all to the story that had already been set running. Dr. Stowell died 4 days later, on the 8th of November, at the age of 85, and his family, in their grief and in their private wish to spare him further distress, burned the whole of his working papers in the small garden of the cottage behind the house, so that all the notes on which he had built his hypothesis, whether or not they had ever amounted to anything, went into the smoke of that small November fire. What Dr. Stowell had truly known, or believed he knew, went with them, and the newspaper story he had never intended to become his legacy sailed on without him. Let us slow the pace still further and see how the story travelled through the years that followed, because a whisper of this kind, once loose, does not go easily back into its box. Through the last weeks of 1970 the papers turned to other headlines, but the theory had been planted in the popular mind, and it soon began to appear in the paperback true crime books that filled the railway station shelves through the following spring. A researcher called Michael Harrison, working on a serious biography of the young prince for the small publisher W. H. Allen, hurried his book out into print in 1972 under the title Clarence, The Life of H. R. T. H. The Duke of Clarence and Avondale, and though Harrison himself did not believe the prince had been the killer, he devoted a long chapter to considering the theory, and in the end suggested a compromise position of his own, that the killer had not been the prince, but the prince's Cambridge tutor and friend James Kenneth Stephen, acting perhaps in some sort of jealous rage. Harrison's book was closely read and widely reviewed, and in the small way of these things it did as much as the newspapers had done to keep the name of the prince alive in the case, even as it took him out of the direct line of blame. Come and see how the story now grew a second life it had never had before. Through the middle years of the 1970s, the theory began to be written up in the popular magazines of both England and America, in colour, features with reproductions of the old court circulars, set alongside sketches of the prince in his hussar's uniform, and photographs of the fog-bound courts of Whitechapel. Television began to take an interest, and the BBC prepared a small documentary series on the case for its serious evening schedule, and a film company began to plan a large feature film for the following decade. In the pubs of the East End, the local guides, who had by then begun to run small walking tours for the tourists of the case, telling the story of the murders as they walked the streets from Bucks Row to Miller's Court, began to add to the end of their tours a short remark about the prince, in the tone of an amusing modern footnote, and their groups of visitors listened and shook their heads and passed the story on. Let us slow the pace one more time and stand for a moment on a wet November evening in Whitechapel in the middle of the decade, because it is the plainest possible picture of how the whisper had by then travelled. On such an evening in 1975, a small group of tourists in raincoats, carrying umbrellas and holding their small guidebooks close to their chests, followed a guide with a wooden staff along the pavement of what had once been Dorset Street. The old rookery buildings were long gone, and the flats and warehouses of the newer century stood in their place, and the guide walked his group slowly along the pavement and pointed out the place where the passage into Miller's Court had once opened, and after he had told the story of the last murder in a low, careful voice, he turned to his group and said with a small smile that some now thought the man behind it all had been the young prince who had died at Sandringham, and the group of tourists looked at one another in the wet light and shook their chnai, and the critics minute straight. Along the pavement behind them a bus turned into the road with its headlamps on, and its yellow light swung slowly across the wet stone of the buildings and passed over the place where the little rooms had once stood, and the whisper, awake now for the first time in 80 years, moved on with the small group of tourists into the ordinary evening traffic of the parish, and did not yet know where it was going next. A Siptif. Chapter 9. The theory that wouldn't die come with me now, quietly, from that small group of tourists in their raincoats on the pavement of what had once been Dorset Street, and let us follow the whisper into the great full-throated shape it was about to take, because in the last years of the 1970s a book was written that turned the small quiet hypothesis of an old surgeon in Surrey into a great public conspiracy that would run for the rest of the century. To follow the story honestly, we must walk with the book and its theory as they went, and then set them beside the plain quiet record of what was already known to be true, and let the two stand together while you decide which of them the parish and the young man ever truly deserved. The book was called Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, and it was published in London in the summer of 1976 by a small serious house called Harrop. Its author was a journalist called Stephen Knight, who was then 25 years old and who had been sent a few years before by a London evening paper to interview a soft-spoken man in his late 60s named Joseph Sickert, the son of the celebrated Victorian painter Walter Sickert. Joseph Sickert had told the young journalist over a long evening at his flat the outline of a great family secret his father had, he said, whispered to him in the last months of his life. And Knight had gone away from that flat convinced that he had heard the true story at last, and had spent the next 3 years digging up whatever else could be made to fit around it, and had brought it out at last in the shape of a serious book of over 200 pages, with a plain black jacket and a dense set of footnotes at the back. Let us slow the pace, you and I, and take the theory itself in the shape Knight gave it. Because the theory has since travelled so far, in so many forms, that a plain summary is a small kindness. In Knight's telling, the trouble had begun long before the murders. In the middle of the 1880s, when Prince Albert Victor, sent by his father to be quietly introduced to the studios of London as a young man of the world, had fallen in love with a young shopgirl of the East End named Annie Elizabeth Crook, who was a Catholic and a commoner. In Knight's telling, the prince had secretly married this shopgirl in a Catholic ceremony at a small church in Marylebone, and had fathered a daughter by her, called Alice. And when word of the marriage reached the Queen and the Prime Minister, they had panicked and had sent the royal physician Sir William Gull, together with a coachman named John Netley and the painter Walter Sickert, to seize the young mother and to silence the small circle of her friends who had come to know of the marriage. In Knight's telling, the 5 women lost in Whitechapel, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes and Kelly, had all in some way been connected to that circle, and the killings had been the work of Sir William Gull in his carriage, ritually staged to make them look like the work of a madman, in order to hide the true reason behind the killing of a group of women who had known the great secret at the heart of the state. Come, and stand a moment inside the shape of this story, because it is important to see how carefully Knight built it. He offered names and dates and addresses and a marriage certificate, and a claim of witnesses, and a whole small architecture of documents and rooms. He wove in the Freemasonry of the age, and drew the theory of a ritual pattern out of the plain physical facts of the crimes, and he tied it all together with a great steady thread of secret power, in which every accident of the case became a proof of the conspiracy, and every failure of the police became a proof that the conspiracy, and every failure of the police became a frommed find what the date dubbing not what. To a reader coming to the case for the first time, the book was a plain marvel, and it read like a good detective novel, in which every small clue at last found its place. And when it was published in that summer, the newspapers of the country reviewed it seriously, and the paperback edition sold widely, and the theory it laid out passed within a year into the general knowledge of the case, so that for a whole generation of readers, the name of the Prince Albert Victor and the great royal conspiracy was spoken in the same breath as the murders themselves. Let us slow the pace and hold the shape of the theory in mind for a moment, because it is worth seeing that it was not one theory, but a family of them, and that Knight himself was only the middle of the family. Before him, Michael Harrison had proposed a milder version, in which the prince was innocent, but his friend James Kennett Stephen had done the killing. After him, other writers took Knight's structure and tried variations upon it, some placing the prince himself in the coach, some placing the prince himself in the coach, some placing him nowhere near it, some replacing Gull with another physician, some replacing Sickert with a different painter. In 1978, the BBC ran a series drama series on the case that carried the theory to a great national audience, and in the same year, the film director Bob Clark made a Sherlock Holmes picture called Murder by Decree, in which the great fictional detective was set to solve the case and to uncover, at the end, a version of the royal conspiracy that had by then become the popular shape of the story. From 1989, the writer Alan Moore and the artist Eddy Campbell began to bring out, in a long series of small paperback volumes, a great, dense graphic novel called From Hell, which took Knight's theory as its starting point and built upon it a still darker and more visionary telling. And in 2001, the American filmmakers the Hughes brothers made a large feature film of the same title with the actor Johnny Depp in the part of Inspector Abberline, in which the royal conspiracy was again at the centre of the story. In each of these tellings, the young prince, or his physician, or his tutor, was placed at the heart of the case, and the plain patient work of the H Division of the Metropolitan Police was set aside, and the whisper that had first come out of the small penciled question mark in Philippe Julien's Paris office in the 1950s now filled every popular telling of the case in the English-speaking world. Come now, and let us walk quietly out of the noise of the popular tellings and into the small quiet room where the plain patient answers to them were being written down through the same years. In the same decade in which Knight's book was being sold in the railway station shelves, a group of serious researchers into the case, working out of the archives of the Metropolitan Police and the National Archives and the Royal Archives at Windsor, began to check every claim of the theory against the surviving documents, and their findings, when they were published in a series of careful articles and books through the 1980s and 1990s, took the theory apart, piece by piece, in the plain way that patient work sometimes does. Let us set out those findings gently and let them speak for themselves. The first and heaviest of them was the plain matter of where the young prince had been on the nights the women were lost, which we have already walked through in an earlier chapter, but must set down again here, because it is the ground on which everything else in the theory stands or falls. The court circulars of the newspapers of the country, printed each morning as a plain public record and preserved in complete runs at the British Library, place Prince Albert Victor at a series of country houses and cavalry barracks far from London on every one of the nights in question. On the night of the 31st, 1888, when Mary Ann Nichols was killed in Bucks Row, the circular records the prince is staying at Danby Lodge near Grosemont in Yorkshire on a shooting party of the Viscount Down. On the night of the 8th of September, when Annie Chapman was killed in Hanbury Street, the circular records him at the cavalry barracks in York, on the routine business of the tent hussars, on the last night of September, when Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed in Cowlin, in the Quain. On the 9th of November, when Mary Jane Kelly was killed in Miller's Court, the circular places him at Sandringham with his family, and the private letters of the Prince of Wales confirm his presence there in independent hand. In order for any version of the royal conspiracy theory to place the prince himself at any one of these scenes, every one of these records must be false, and every one of the officials of the court who signed them must have been part of the conspiracy, and every one of the newspapers that printed them must have been deceived. And on the plain balance of the evidence, none of that is remotely likely, and no serious writer on the case now argues that it is. Let us slow the pace, and set beside this the next of the plain findings, which is the small quiet dissolution of the marriage that stands at the heart of Knight's theory. In Knight's telling, Annie Elizabeth Crooke had married the young prince in a Catholic ceremony at a small church in Marylebone, had lived with him at a set of rooms in Cleveland Street, and had borne him a daughter named Alice, before being seized and confined to an asylum by the servants of the state. The plain surviving records, dug up in the years after Knight's book by the researcher Donald Rumbelow and by other patient historians of the case, tell a different and much simpler story. There was indeed a young woman called Annie Elizabeth Crooke, who did indeed live in the neighbourhood of Cleveland Street, and who did indeed bear a daughter named Alice Margaret Crooke in April of 1885. But the birth was recorded in the ordinary register of the parish, with the name of the father left blank in the plain way that such births were often recorded then, and the young mother was never married to the prince or to anyone else, and she never went into an asylum in the manner Knight described. She lived on for many years in ordinary poverty in London, spending stretches of time in the workhouses of the parish as the poor often did, and dying only in the late 1920s. And her daughter Alice lived on into old age as well, and was known to a number of researchers of the case, and gave her own quiet account of her mother's life to those who came to ask. Come with me a little further, because the third of the plain findings concerns the physician at the centre of the story. Sir William Whitechapel, the royal physician on whom Knight's theory rested the whole of the killings, was in 1880 a man of 72 who had suffered a serious stroke a year and a half before. in October of 1887 and who had spent the whole of the year of the murders in the slow, careful convalescence of an elderly man of his class. His private papers, held in the archive of Guy's Hospital, and the letters of his physicians and his family, place him almost always at his London house on Brook Street, or at his country home in Scotland through the whole of that autumn, and describe him as unable to walk without a stick, unable to drive himself in a carriage, and unable to work for more than short, careful stretches. The picture of a nimble, ruthless assassin driving a black broom through the wet courts of Whitechapel and performing terrible surgeries by lantern light is not, on any honest reading of the surviving papers, a picture that Sir William Gull, as he then was, could possibly have filled. Sir William Gull died in January of 1890 of a further stroke, quietly at home in the presence of his family, and never in his last months of memoir writing spoke, in any surviving letter or note, of the case or of the young prince at Sandringham. Let us slow the pace one more time, and set down the last of the plain findings, which is the small quiet matter of Sir Robert Anderson's Polish Jew. Sir Robert Anderson, who had been head of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard through the autumn of 1888, wrote in his private memoir in 1910 that the true killer had been a poor Polish Jew of the East End, who had been identified by a witness at the time, and had been quietly confined to an asylum soon afterwards. His identification, and the further careful private memorandum of Sir Melville Macnaghten of the Yard, both point to a man called Aaron Kosminski, who had lived in a set of rooms above his brother's tailor shop on Sion Square in Whitechapel, and who had been detained in the workhouse of the parish in July of 1890, and moved to the Colney Hatch Asylum in the following February, and who had died in the Leavesden Asylum in 1990. He was a very poor man, and a very disordered man, and he had lived only a few short streets from every one of the sites of the murders. Whatever the truth of the case, the men who had actually run the investigation, in the years afterwards when they wrote what they knew, did not point at any palace or any physician or any painter. They pointed at a man in a small tailor's flat in Whitechapel itself. Come and let us stand a moment above the whole shape of this, because there is a small pattern here worth naming plainly. The great popular theory that filled the paperbacks and the films of the last quarter of the 20th century placed the killings at the doors of a palace and a hospital and a studio, and made of the case a great story of secret power. The plain, patient work of the archives, done through the same years by researchers who had no book of theirs to sell, placed the killings back in the small, quiet rooms of the parish itself, and gave, at the end, no answer of any certain kind, and admitted that the case was in its own plain way an unsolved crime of the poor by the poor, in a parish where poverty had already killed thousands in slower ways. In the end, the great theory sold better because it made a better story, and the plain, patient answer was left to those who cared enough about the truth to read the small, careful articles in the small, careful journals through the years that followed. Yet the truth, in these things, has a small, quiet way of standing, even when it is much outshouted by the tellings placed around it. Along the pavement outside the London Library, on a wet November afternoon in the middle of the 1990s, a young researcher in a long coat carrying a satchel of photocopied court circulars from the year 1888 paused for a moment at the top of the steps and looked out at the small rain falling on St. James's Square, and drew the satchel a little closer under her arm, and went down the steps into the darkening street with the plain, quiet paper of the past held safe against her side. Usapic. Chapter 10. The names and the dark come away with me now, from the wet steps of the London Library, and from the small satchel of court circulars held close under a young researcher's arm, and let us walk together out into the very evening in which we ourselves are sitting, because the story we have followed through all these hours has at last come home to the plain, quiet present in which you and I are meeting, and there are reeting small places we ought to go together before we let it rest. The parish of Whitechapel in the year of our own lives is a very different place from the parish that walked its courts by lantern light in the last autumn of 1880, and the small good work of that difference is one of the honest things about how a city carries its worst hours forward. The narrow rookeries behind Commercial Street are long gone, cleared away by the reforming trusts of the early years of the last century, and the great mission halls and dwelling blocks of yellow brick that replaced them have themselves in many places been cleared away in their turn, and in their place stand the plain warm shops and cafes and small offices of the Bangladeshi community that has made these streets its own since the middle years of the last century. The doss houses of Flower and Dean Street have been gone for well over 100 years, and Flower and Dean Street itself is no longer to be found by that name on any map. Its ground taken up now by the Charlotte de Rothschild dwellings and by the small green playground of a primary school. Bucks Row, where the first of the women was found in the last hour of August, has long since been renamed Durward Street, and the wall of the schoolyard against which she lay still stands, though the school itself is now a set of quiet flats, and the wall carries no sign of what happened beside it. Hanbury Street, where the second of the women was found in the small paved yard behind number 29, still runs east from Commercial Street through Spitalfields, though the small paved yard is long gone, and a modern brewery building took its place in the 1970s, and has since been converted into an office block whose plain glass doors give onto a lobby of pale wood and low couches. Berner Street, where the third of the women was found in the entry of the Working Men's Club, was renamed Enrique Street in the 1950s, and now runs quietly between small blocks of council flats and the plain brick of a modern synagogue. Mitre Square, where the fourth of the women was found within the boundary of the City of London, still opens as it always did between Mitre Street and Duke's Place, though the small dark corner in which she lay has long since been swept clear, and a small square garden of paving stones and low iron rails now sits at its centre. Miller's Court, where the last of the women was found on the wet morning of the 9th of November, was walled up in the last years of the last century and has since been built over entirely, and Dorset Street itself was renamed Duval Street and then closed altogether, and its ground is now taken up by the loading yards of a car park that stands behind the old Spitalfields market building. Let us slow the pace, you and I, and stand a moment on the pavement of what was once Dorset Street in the plain grey evening of our own century, because it is one of the small good ways of feeling the whole shape of the story. Above the low walls of the car park, the late lights of the office buildings of the modern city are coming on in their thousand small squares, and a train rumbles along the elevated line that runs into Liverpool Street Station, a short walk to the west, and the traffic on Commercial Street sounds its horns and moves on into the wet dark toward the river. A small group of tourists in raincoats, carrying their small guidebooks close to their chests, follow a guide with a soft voice along the pavement, and stop where the passage into Miller's Court once opened, and hear the last of the story in the low, careful voice their guide has learned to use for this stop of the walk. When she is finished, she does not add, as an earlier generation of guides sometimes did, a small joking remark about a young prince at Sandringham. She names instead the 5 women who were lost, and lets the wet pavement hold their names a moment before her group moves on. This is a small good change, and it is worth marking. Come with me now, if you will, out of the parish of Whitechapel and across the flat, cold country of Norfolk, to the great red brick and white stone house at Sandringham, because it too still stands, and it too has its own quiet corner of this story. Sandringham House is now one of the private homes of the reigning family of the country, and is not much open to the public, but its gardens and its parish church may be visited on quiet days through the summer, and a small careful memorial to the young man who died in the upstairs bedroom in January of 1892 still stands where it was set. He was buried, as we have seen, at Windsor, in the small Albert Memorial Chapel to the east of St. George's Chapel, and his marble tomb is there still. The tall, thin young officer in the plain uniform of the 10 Possers, the bronze angel weeping quietly at his head, the sculptor's careful lettering set at his feet. On a quiet afternoon in the plain grey light of an English winter, a visitor coming into the chapel from the great west door may walk down the aisle and turn left into the smaller chapel, and come at last to the marble figure and stand a moment beside it, and read the plain name on the plaque, Albert Victor Christian Edward, and hold in mind the young man who lived, and who was gentle to the last, and whose face the whispering of the last 150 years has tried again and again to press on to a fog it never touched. Let us slow now, one small step further, and stand for a moment inside the plain, steady record of what was known and what was not, because the whole quiet work of the story we have followed has been the slow, patient distinguishing of the one from the other. It is known that between the 31st of August and the 9th of November in 1888, in a small stretch of streets of the East End of London, 5 women were killed by a hand, or hands that the police and the courts of the day were never able to name, and that no serious researcher of the case has ever since been able to name with certainty. It is known that the man or men who did this crossed those streets under cover of fog and lantern light, and were never seen clearly by any surviving witness, and that the papers of the Metropolitan Police were closed at last in 1892 without an arrest. It is known that the men who ran the investigation, when they wrote in their old age of what they had believed, pointed always at poor obscure men of the parish itself, and not at any door of any palace. It is known in the plain patient record of the court circulars of the country and the private letters of the royal household that Prince Albert Victor was in Yorkshire and in York and in Scotland and in Norfolk through the whole of that autumn, and that he was never at any time in the parish of Whitechapel while it stood in fear of the killer. And it is known that he lived on gently for 3 more years and died at 28 of the influenza in January of 1892, in an upstairs bedroom of the great house in Norfolk, with his mother beside him, and in her heard, "Come, and let us set beside these plain known things the plain unknown things also, because the story ought to close in honesty on both sides. It is not known who killed the 5 women. It is not known why he chose the streets he chose, or the nights he chose, or the women he chose. It is not known whether he stopped killing because he was confined, or because he died, or because he moved to another city, or for reasons that will never be given a name. It is not known whether the letters signed Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie and From Hell were written by him or by another hand, though the officers closest to the case came in later years to believe that some of them at least were the work of a journalist. It is not known where the small chalk message on the wall of Golston Street had come from, or by whose hand it had been written. It is not known whether Sir Robert Anderson was right in the small quiet paragraph of his memoir that the killer had been a poor Polish Jew who had ended his days in an asylum. These are the plain unknown things of the case, and they will remain unknown for as long as the case is remembered. And the whispering that grew from them has always been, in the end, the whispering of a fear that could not sit quietly with what it did not know. Let us slow to the very slowest pace of all now, and speak the 5 names softly, because they are the plain, small heart of the whole story, and no telling of the case is complete without them. Mary Ann Nichols, who was 43 and had known kinder years before her hardest ones, and who was found in the last hour of the 31st of August in the row behind the London Hospital, in a doorway of a warehouse near a stable yard. Annie Chapman, who was 47, and who had been born Annie Smith, and who had loved her children through years of great trouble, and who was found in the small paved yard behind the house in Hanbury Street on the morning of the 8th of September. Elizabeth Stride, who was 44, and who had come from Sweden as a young woman, and who was known in the parish as Long Liz for the plain kindness of her long face, and who was found in the entry of the club yard on Berner Street in the last hour of the 29th of September. Catherine Eddowes, who was 46, and who had returned that very evening from hop-picking in the Kent orchards, and who was known to her friends for a light laugh and a gentle way with children, and who was found in the darkest corner of Mitre Square in the small hour that followed. Mary Jane Kelly, who was only 25, and who had come from Ireland as a small child, and who had lived in the small room off Miller's Court with her few possessions and a canary in a small cage, and who was found on the morning of the 9th of November in the last quiet room of the case. Speak their names, and hold them a moment, and let the whispering that grew around them fall quiet at last. Come now, and let us set the small motif of our story down beside them, because the whispering that has run through every chapter of this telling has at last come to the place where it must rest. Along the courts of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, the whispering carried the small news of a parish, and then the fear of a killer no one could see, and then, when no face was ever given to that killer, the whispering grew hungry, and looked outward for a name, and could not find one, and long afterwards, in the very different room of the last century, the whispering woke again, and found the name of a gentle young man, who had died at 28 of the influenza, and pressed his face onto the fog that his life had never tipped. This is the plain shape of the theory that would not die. The whispering has by our own time grown quieter, in the small good work of the patient researchers and the plain honest guides, and the 5 names are spoken again in the parish where they were lost, and the young man in the marble uniform at Windsor is being slowly given back the ordinary honour of his own quiet life. Yet the whispering has not gone entirely, and it will not, for as long as a fear that could not name what it feared still runs, from time to time, through the small rooms of the world. Along the pavement of what was once Dorset Street, on the wet grey evening of our own century, the small group of tourists in raincoats has moved on now toward Commercial Street, and the guide with the soft voice has folded her small guidebook back into her bag, and the last light of the offices above the car park stands warm in the wet dark. In a small chapel far from here, in the north of Windsor, a verger in a black cassock passes quietly through the choir stalls with a soft cloth in his hand, and stops for a moment at the marble figure of the young officer in the plain uniform of the 10th Hussars, and rests his hand a moment on the cool stone at the young man's foot, and moves on down the aisle. And in the ordinary evening traffic of both places, and of every place between them, the whispering that has carried this story across the years falls at last, softly and without resistance, into a hush that even the fog cannot lift,